The first time I saw her run, I said, whoa, this girl is rolling.
She was probably the best runner in the state, and she was a hopeful for the Olympics.
Shelly had left to go to a party in Center City and never returned home.
Flyers are going up. People were knocking on doors.
He found what appeared to be the remains of a human being.
People are shocked. This is not the outcome that they wanted.
Well, I'm hearing rumors of her mom being jealous, not being a good person at all.
She was sobbing periodically, but never did I see an actual tear.
It's just mind-boggling.
It's 1993 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the city of brotherly love.
Philly was alive with energy. It was, it's the early 90s, so hip-hop is at an all-time high. It's a new art form. Everybody's, the fashion, Philly high schools, we're just like one big hip-hop video. In West Philly, you would have saw sweatsuits and colors and hoodies and fly sneakers and jewelry and leather jackets. You would have got all of that flavor.
On the evening of Tuesday, January 19th, police in West Philadelphia get a call from a concerned mother. Vivian King reports that her 17-year-old daughter, Shelly, is missing.
Her daughter had told her that she was leaving on Sunday night, the 17th, to go to a party.
Vivian had hoped that she had stayed overnight with a girlfriend. Shelly stayed out and stayed at girlfriends' houses frequently.
But now, her daughter has been gone for nearly 48 hours.
The last that this mother knew, her daughter was going to a party with friends. So what happened to Shelly? Why did she disappear?
Born on March 15, 1975, Shelly grew up in a quiet neighborhood in West Philadelphia.
Shelly lived on Edgewood Street, a working-class black neighborhood, and it was a very typical neighborhood.
Her stepfather was Clarence Jones, and her mother was Vivian King. Shelly's last name was Turner, but she did not know her father.
Shelly lived with her mother, her stepfather, who was also the biological father of her younger sister.
He had raised Shelly from when Shelly was like 6 months old. He had been in the picture all of those years. Vivian King was a nurse's aide. She helped Clarence Jones with his newspaper route. He delivered papers to a warehouse, and including the Sunday paper.
Shelly Turner was really a precocious kind of kid in that she had unbelievable talent.
She had been a runner from the time she was 7 years old. Shelly ran everywhere. She ran to the grocery stores, she ran in the neighborhood.
By the age of 10, Shelly was competing.
Shelly was one of those kids where every track meet, she's walking away like this with 4 trophies.
Her sophomore year in high school, Shelly transferred from Overbrook to William Penn High School to run for legendary coach Tim Hickey.
William Penn's track team was known nationally because of the quality of the girls there. Coach Hickey devoted his life to helping these girls.
William Penn did not have a track of its own, so the girls used to run on the streets. And that's how they became so good, because they were running on concrete.
They ran on the sidewalk, so he had markers out there for 200 meters, 400 meters. This man was brilliant. She adored Mr. Hickey.
Over the next 2 years, Shelly thrived.
She was a senior who had big things ahead for her. Big things. She was running very well.
She was probably the best runner in the state and probably one of the best in the country. And she was hoping to go to college. A couple of schools had already offered her scholarships. And she was hopeful for the Olympics.
She was very humble about it. She was very laid back with it. Like Shelly Turner would tear your head off on a track, but just as well go and just sit back and laugh with you and kick back. She wasn't boastful. She wasn't arrogant or conceited.
Vivian proudly displayed the proof of her daughter's success.
It was like a museum. You know, you walk in Shelly Turner's living room and there are medals, there are trophies, plaques. It was the first thing you noticed when you walked in. It was just wasn't room for anything else. And I told her, I said, if you win one more thing, it's gonna have to go on the porch.
Shelly was a rising star, but that didn't keep her from helping around the house.
Her mother was strict, and she had a lot of responsibility.
She spent her almost entire time either with the track program, school, or at home babysitting her younger sister. She did have her girlfriends, but they were also mostly all track people too.
When you spend so much time with your teammates, it's just like, that's just what it is. You have other friends, you have outside interests, but we ran track. We didn't just participate. We lived it, we breathed it. You know, it was a part of everything we did.
Shelly was driven, responsible, and always where she was supposed to be. Until Vivian reports her missing on the evening of January 19th, 1993. An officer from Philadelphia's 19th District arrives at Vivian's home.
The officer was told by Vivian that her daughter, Shelly, had left on Sunday night to go to a party in Center City and never returned home.
Vivian said that she stayed awake and that Shelly didn't get home and that she eventually went to sleep. And the next morning, Shelly still wasn't there, but Vivian had hoped that she had stayed overnight with a girlfriend.
Shelly had a track meet that she was to be at on Monday on Martin Luther King Day, even though there was no school that day. And she was the captain of the team, and she was a very pivotal part of the team.
Vivian tried to find out if Shelly showed up for the meet.
Vivian King called Mr. Hickey, and he did not return the phone call. So the next morning, which would have been Tuesday morning, Vivian King called the school and asked to speak with Shelly's first period teacher and found out that Shelly had not reported to school that day. Vivian then asked to speak with Mr. Hickey. The teacher went and got Mr. Hickey and brought him to the phone. And Vivian found out that Shelly was the only one that had not come to the meet.
She was the captain of the team. For her to not show up for the track meet indicated that there probably was a severe problem.
Vivian's next phone call was to police.
Anything could have happened to Shelly, from being abducted, being attacked, or just basically maybe stopping at another friend's house and spending the night.
The officer gathers more details.
The JAD officers would have asked what clothing she had been wearing. They would have gotten the names of some of her friends.
Shelly had a purple tracksuit on, purple sneakers.
That information was then passed on to the Juvenile Aid Division people and to the West Detective Division.
The search for Shelly Turner is on.
The entire division, police division and detective division, were made aware of the fact that she was missing. On
Tuesday, January 19th, 1993, investigators with Philadelphia's Juvenile Aid Division begin their search for Shelly Turner. The 17-year-old hasn't been seen since Sunday.
Shelly had told her mother that she was going to be going to a party that night.
It was like a citywide kind of fun thing where whenever there's no school on a Monday, the promoters would promote to us, and we were all in. You know, we liked to dance. William Penn was a dancing track team.
Investigators speak with Shelly's friend Andrea, who lives across the street. She reveals that Shelly didn't go to the party.
She had actually gone to visit a new boyfriend in North Philadelphia.
Shelly had kept her budding romance with fellow student Sean Williams from her mother.
Shelly had no intention of going to this party. Andrea was the only person who knew that Shelly was gonna hang out with Sean, her new boyfriend.
Before Shelly left on the bus for Sean's house, Andrea gave her some last-minute fashion advice.
Her friend said, well, your outfit isn't nice enough with what you're wearing. Wear this jacket with it.
Shelly's wearing a purple tracksuit and a black leather jacket. So that was what they were searching for when they were looking for Shelly.
For detectives, locating Sean Williams is their top priority.
He had transferred in. He was a new student at William Penn. They did talk with him immediately. They got his address through the school.
A couple of detectives came to my house to question me.
Sean tells detectives he met Shelly after transferring to Penn at the beginning of the school year.
My best friend, she kind of brought me into the fold with a lot of the groups at William Penn, and Shelly was part of the track team. I'm seeing her in the gym, I'm seeing her smile. I think she got cute for me that day. She was definitely a pretty girl. After maybe talking on the phone a time or two, now I feel more comfortable kicking it with her.
So, a few days earlier, Sean invited Shelly to his house for Sunday dinner.
My mom fixed dinner every Sunday. She fixed a nice meal. We enjoyed dinner. We laughed. Our family laughs. Just did our Sunday thing. My mom loved her. So after dinner, we go up to the room. We chilling. We talking, listening to music. We having a good time. We just hanging out for a few hours. My mom's in the place, so we're being good. And I guess time got by us for a while, and now it's late.
At approximately 2 in the morning, Shelly had to go home, and he walked Shelly to the bus stop.
I wanted to make sure that she got home safely. The bus took about 20 minutes to come because it's Sunday night. I wanted to give her a kiss. And she was like, no, I don't kiss in public. In that time, the bus driver had to pause a moment to look at us.
Sean tells them Shelly got on.
From that information, they were able to track down the actual bus driver.
He does remember that Shelly went all the way to the last stop and that Shelly gets off on 60th and Girard.
The fact that the bus driver knew that she had gotten off the bus cleared the boyfriend from any involvement.
Now the question is, what happened to Shelly when she got off the bus?
The bus led her off 6 blocks from her home.
Did she get home? Did she not get home? What happened?
In Philadelphia, investigators have traced 17-year-old Shelly Turner's last known whereabouts to a bus stop 6 blocks from her home.
It was very late. Shelly was a young woman out by herself. It was a kind of rough neighborhood because there were a lot of alleyways and there were a lot of vacant houses.
Anything could have happened to Shelly from the time she got off the bus to the time she would have been able to reach her front door.
Police scour every inch between the bus stop and Shelley's home.
They searched the vacant houses, they searched the alleys looking for her. And they would have checked stores, checked neighbors.
Meanwhile, investigators interview Shelley's coach, Tim Hickey. He's deeply troubled over the disappearance of his protege.
Coach Hickey had known her for so many years and was, had such a deep knowledge of all the girls that he had on his track team.
She would talk to him and tell him things that perhaps she didn't tell anyone else. So there was a bond there. There was a trust.
Coach Hickey reveals that Shelley's relationship with Vivian was troubled.
It was not the greatest situation in her house. That there was an amount of conflict between Shelley and Vivian. Shelley had to bring her sister to practices and some of the meets that she had to go to because Vivian had made Shelley be a primary babysitter.
She was not seeing eye to eye with her mother regarding, her expectations, her curfews, and the things that she wanted in her household.
Coach Hickey reports that Shelley hadn't shown up the morning of the track meet.
Shelley was the only one that was not there. So Mr. Hickey, her coach, went to the house looking for Shelley to take with him, along with the rest of the team, on the van.
Shelley's little sister answered the door. Coach Hickey never saw Vivian, but she called out from upstairs.
Vivian informed him that Shelley had not come home the night before.
Vivian said, "She's not here. Check with Kwanda." Kwanda is Shelley's friend who was also on the team with her.
But Coach Hickey tells the investigators that Kwanda didn't know where Shelley was either. Detectives find it odd that Vivian knew Shelley hadn't shown up at the track meet the morning after she went missing. Not 2 days later, like she told police.
I think it would have been imperative that any caring parent would have notified the police immediately to begin an investigation to try to locate the child.
There is a question as to why Vivian waited so long. What was the reason for that?
As investigators continue to search for the missing teen, they get a phone call from Shelley's friend, Andrea.
Her girlfriend's, the one whose jacket it was, saw Clarence Jones wearing that jacket later and didn't understand how he would have gotten that jacket if Shelley never got home.
The fact would be that if the jacket was subsequently seen several days later, it meant that Shelley had come back to the house with that jacket. That directed our attention more to Clarence at that point in time as being possibly involved in what had happened with Shelley.
Detectives bring in Clarence for questioning.
Clarence explained that he just picked up a jacket that he saw in the living room. He didn't know whose it was. He just saw this jacket and he put it on.
Clarence is very adamant about the fact that he just grabbed the first jacket that he saw and that there were other jackets, black jackets, in the home.
Clarence says that on the night Shelley went missing, he got up at 2:30 a.m. to get ready for work.
And Shelley still wasn't home. And he kept asking, "Where's Shelley? Where's Shelley?" And Vivian didn't know.
He delivered newspapers in the mornings. He would be gone from approximately 3 a.m. until he was finished his paper route.
Clarence's employer verifies his alibi.
Because of the timeline, it would not be possible for Clarence to have been home if Shelley did, in fact, go back to her house the night that she went missing.
The search of the 6 blocks between Shelley's house and the bus stop is also a dead end.
They have no leads. The Philadelphia department has 0.
It became an everyday focus of the media here in Philadelphia of what happened to Shelley, where is Shelley?
Now flyers are going up. They're hanging them on telephone poles. There were marches, people were walking, they were looking, they were knocking on doors.
This particular community came together and raised $6,000. This neighborhood is not a neighborhood of affluence, you know, there's not a lot of money going around. But people were very invested. They wanted to find Shelley. Days turns into weeks, and now people are becoming desperate, and people want answers. People want Shelley to be alive. They want to find her alive.
It's February 1993. Shelley Turner has been missing for 4 weeks. Speculation runs wild through her West Philadelphia neighborhood.
She might have been grabbed. She might have been held captive. She might have been killed. She might have run away.
The city, especially the West Detective Division and the uniformed districts in West Philadelphia, were in a constant search for Shelley.
As the community continues to look for the 17-year-old track star, taking center stage is her mother, Vivian.
She's a local celebrity. People hear her on the radio, they read about her in the newspaper, they've seen her on TV.
There were marches led by Miss King, and she was very much in the news media, presenting herself to them as a grieving mother.
Behind closed doors, Vivian is less optimistic.
I started going to Vivian King's house, of course, with my teammates, but after a while, like as the days go on, as the weeks go on, the crowds get smaller. The visits are fewer. So there were times I went by myself. She would say, "We're never gonna see Shay again." She said, "Mister, this is bad." I said, "Don't say that." You know, as a 17-year-old, I'm like, no. We're gonna work this out. She said, "I feel it in my gut. We ain't never gonna see her again." She was very negative about ever seeing her daughter again. And of course, that made me very sad. That made me very upset.
On February 20th, 33 days after Shelley went missing, the case takes a grim turn.
A man was out walking his dog in the Fairmount Park area of Philadelphia near the Mann Music Center.
You're talking about a huge open area with trees. That area is very well populated in the summer, but not so much in the winter.
The dog was acting strange and pulled the man into an area where there were some trees, a wooded area.
The dog guides him toward a blue tarp, streaked with what appears to be dried blood.
When the man went to investigate, he found what appeared to be the remains of a human being.
Within minutes, the park is swarming with law enforcement. They see what appears to be the body of a young female.
Her body was frozen because it was a very, very cold period of time here in Philadelphia. The type of sweatshirt she had on was an inside out. It was on inside out. The pants she had were somewhat of track kind of clothing. Also, there were no footwear. To us, it appeared to us that, you know, she had dressed very, very quickly to leave wherever she had been prior to being there in the park. It was recognized that it very possibly could be the body of Shelley Turner.
While the cause of death isn't clear, wounds to the victim's face and head indicate foul play.
There was indications of blunt force trauma. The way that her hands were found with her body being frozen, her hand was up in front of her face as if she were trying to ward off the attack.
Investigators do not locate any other evidence.
So at that point, they didn't have any conclusive answers.
The next day, Vivian comes to the morgue.
Her body did not deteriorate because of the cold, because she was frozen.
Vivian is shown 5 pictures. They're Polaroids. So based off those 5 pictures, Vivian does in fact identify Shelly Turner as the young woman that they found in Fairmount Park.
The medical examiner determines a cause of death.
Shelly was hit in the head with an object, and then she was shot 6 times.
She has some shots through her chest, through her head, and through her left hand.
Now it's a homicide. And we would start back at the very beginning and re-interview everyone.
The day after she IDs her daughter's body, homicide detectives meet with Vivian at her home.
She was very adamant that we should look into Sean because she related to us that night that she believed Sean lied to her.
Vivian tells detectives she called Sean after Shelly disappeared.
According to her, Sean had made a sausage sandwich for Shelly while she was there, and Vivian inquired whether it was pork or beef, and according to Sean initially, it was a pork sandwich. And then when she questioned him more about the kind of sandwich, he eventually said, oh, perhaps it might have been a beef sandwich. And she felt that was extremely important because, according to Vivian, Shelly was allergic to pork. And when we left the house, that was going to be our next step. We knew that Sean was going to be someone that we wanted to speak to as soon as we could.
After learning that her daughter's missing persons case has just been declared a homicide, Vivian King encourages police to look again at her daughter's suitor, Sean Williams.
We went to his residence, and then we asked Sean if he would come with us to homicide to give a formal statement, and he agreed to do that.
I'm a 17-year-old kid at this time, so I'm not thinking about if you're trying to ask me questions to trick me up or anything like that. I have no sense of that at all. Like, I'm just answering your questions as honestly as I possibly can. And I just wanted to help.
He also agreed to be polygraphed.
I didn't have anything to hide. I wasn't scared.
The person conducting the test informed us that there was no deception indicated by Sean, and that it was the operator's belief that he was telling the truth, that Shelly had gotten on the bus that evening when she disappeared and was last seen by Sean at that point in time. It was not Sean. Sean had no hand in whatsoever what had happened to Shelly.
Shelly's funeral takes place on February 27th. Over 1,200 people turn out.
It was with teenagers everywhere, just bawling their eyes out, just losing it. It was a mess. It was probably one of the worst days of our young lives. There was very little emotion with Vivian King. You know, maybe a tear trickled, maybe. We were like overwhelmed with grief, and this woman was sitting there with a tight jaw and a tight face. Nobody hugged Vivian King. Nobody talked to her.
Well, I'm hearing rumors of her mom being jealous. They don't get along. I'm hearing, just rumors of her mom just not being a good person at all.
The whispers and stares don't go unnoticed.
About a week and a half after Shelly's body had been discovered, Vivian called. She was hearing rumors, and she wanted to know how she could dispel those rumors. We went over everything again, everything that had transpired from the day that Shelly was last seen. And she related to us how she had cooked dinner, and she right away said she made pork chops, peas, and potatoes, mashed potatoes. Vivian obviously did not remember that she had told us that Shelly had been allergic to pork. Vivian herself was lying. She was trying to direct us towards Sean.
But why? Unaware she was just caught in a lie, Vivian continues her quest to clear her name.
She had mentioned that she had been told that she could take a lie detector test. Vivian, at that point in time, was very adamant she wanted to take that because she believed that she could then tell people she took a polygraph test and passed the test and had nothing to do with what had happened to Shelly.
Results were she had flunked.
We informed her that there was deception indicated, that she was not telling the truth. Vivian started telling us at that point that there were things she just didn't remember. Bits and pieces would come back to her, but she was telling us she just had trouble remembering everything from that night.
Detectives questioned Vivian for hours.
We quietly reviewed with her the problems with her story. The pork chop, Shelly being allergic to that. Also the fact that the black jacket was seen being worn by Clarence days after Shelly had supposedly left and never returned to the house. Vivian, was actually recognizing that the lies that she had told and that none of them were going to hold up. And at that point, she basically was willing to say what had happened.
Vivian tells police that on Sunday, January 17th, she had been out with friends.
She had consumed quite a bit of liquor, and she was also telling us how she had a problem with liquor. When she came home that evening, she found that Shelly had left to go to the party.
Shelly's 1 a.m. curfew came and went.
Vivian waited up for a long period of time and was getting angrier and angrier.
Shelly got into the house about 2:30, having walked from the bus stop. When she got home, her mother and she got into an argument about what time she had come in, and they got into a fight.
And they start kind of tussling back and forth.
Vivian then went upstairs and got her own gun from under her mattress and went downstairs and then confronted Shelly again.
Vivian says that she hit Shelly in the head with the gun and then tells Shelly, "You can't live here anymore. You're not following my rules."
Her mother said, "I'm going to take you to the police station and they're going to put you in a home for bad girls." So she made her get into the car.
The arguing continued.
Vivian claims that she got so angry that she did not go to the police station. She was gonna go fight Shelly.
She then drove into the park. She drove some distance across the grass, according to her, stopped near some trees.
Vivian King made Shelly get out of the car in the park. And they said, "Okay, we're going to fight here." And they actually got into a fist fight.
Shelly had picked up a bottle from the ground, and when she did, Vivian then hit Shelly on the side of the head again with the gun.
Shelly fell to the ground, stunned by the blow.
And while she was laying on the ground, Vivian fired her gun.
Vivian took her gun and shot Shelley 6 times, killing her. She then left her under a tarp that was in the park and some weeds and things, and then went home.
She put her gun back under her mattress and went to sleep.
She says she wakes up the next morning and feels like she just had a bad nightmare.
She had a look of resignation on her face. She was sobbing periodically, but never did I see an actual tear.
Vivian King is arrested and charged with Shelley's murder.
When the news broke that she confessed, of course, that rocked everybody's world. Now all I see is pure evil.
But just days later, at her arraignment, Vivian pleads not guilty.
She says the confession was coerced.
After confessing to shooting her 17-year-old daughter to death in a park, Vivian King now claims her confession was coerced. She sticks by her innocence until October 20th, 1993, when her trial begins.
I'm arguing for first-degree murder, for life as the penalty. I really thought 6 shots was enough for murder 1.
The case hinges on Vivian's confession, a confession she now claims isn't true.
They had no evidence. They had nothing to tie her to it. They didn't have the gun, and they had nothing to convict her except for the confession.
Prosecutors call multiple witnesses who attest to Vivian's well-known temper.
She liked to drink. That was her sport. She liked to go to bars. She liked to fraternize in bars.
When she did drink, she knew that she got angry, and most of her anger was always directed at Shelley.
Shelley was a star. Shelley shined on that track.
She was very jealous of Shelley.
Coach Hickey testifies that Shelley was one of the best runners in the country, in spite of her mother.
She was one of the few parents, I think, who did not go to the meets.
Prosecutors present Vivian's confession as proof of what happened when tension between mother and daughter came to a head.
It was so horrifyingly specific that you're not going to come to the great detail of that kind of confession unless you really did it.
Vivian takes the stand.
Her defense is, I didn't say this willingly. I was coerced into this confession.
Vivian claims the only part of the confession that's true is that she was drunk.
In total, Vivian has had about 88 ounces of liquor over the course of those hours. That's about 11 cups.
Her attorneys argue that Shelley probably fell victim to a random act of violence.
There was conversation about this possibly being a robbery. She did not have her shoes. She did not have a Walkman that Andrea, her friend from across the street, had loaned her. She was missing an earring.
The jury deliberates for 6 hours.
Ultimately, the jury found her guilty of third-degree murder.
It's very hard for a jury to believe that a mother who has raised a daughter 17 years intends to kill her, even with 6 shots to the head and the body. It's just hard. It's easier for them to think, okay, she was drunk, but she didn't really intend for her to die.
It's just mind-boggling to think that a mother could stand over her daughter and shoot her, but we believed the confession.
Vivian is sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison. She's released after 11 years.
What happened with Shelly, I believe, that time of my life, it stunted my growth. I'm still mourning.
She was a real person who had real dreams. Her story deserves to be told. I think her legacy deserves to be heard.
The heavy, oppressive silence of the West Sacramento night felt like a living thing, a shroud that masked the invisible rot, which had settled into the very foundation of the life Rachel Alvarez had meticulously constructed. For 18 years, she had anchored her entire existence to a man who wore his authority like a suit of impenetrable armor. A police officer, a protector, a man whose silver badge was supposed to signify the ultimate shield against the encroaching darkness of the world. But as the shadows stretched across the floorboards of their home, the reality was far more jagged and grotesque than any nightmare she could have conjured. Rachel, a woman who had spent her entire childhood as a displaced soul, desperately searching for the roots she had been denied, believed she had finally found her sanctuary in Sergio. She saw in him the strength of a protector, the stability of a provider, and the promise of a family that would never abandon her. She had surrendered her heart, her identity, and her future to a man she perceived as God's own gift to her, never suspecting that the man sleeping beside her was not a protector, but a predator who had been hunting in the dark while she played the role of the devoted, doting wife. The air in the bedroom was thick with the suffocating weight of a decade and a half of calculated deception, a secret that had been growing, festering, and feeding on the vulnerability of strangers and the innocence of his own household. This was not merely a case of marital infidelity or a midlife crisis. It was the total erasure of everything Rachel believed to be true about the nature of love and duty. Behind the charismatic, winning smile that had won him the title of homecoming king years ago, and behind the badge that demanded the silent respect of the community, lay a cavernous, empty void where a conscience should have been. Every memory she cherished, the early days of their romance, the birth of their children, the quiet domestic rituals of grocery shopping and family dinners, was now poisoned by the agonizing realization that they were merely scenes in an elaborate, sinister performance. The monster was not a stranger lurking in the bushes waiting to strike. He was the man who sat across from her at the kitchen table every morning, the man who kissed their children goodnight with the same hands that had forced themselves upon terrified, marginalized women on the outskirts of town. As the clock ticked into the early, hollow hours, the realization began to claw at her throat. She had spent nearly 2 decades building a home with a man who was systematically destroying the lives of others, using his authority as a weapon of mass consumption. The life she thought she knew was a thin, fragile veneer, and now the wood was splintering, the paint was peeling, and the true face of the man she had loved was staring back at her from the abyss. She was standing in the center of a life that had become an active crime scene, feeling the foundations of her world collapse under the sheer, monstrous weight of a secret that was finally beginning to scream for justice. The tragedy was not just that she had lost the man she thought he was. It was the terrifying epiphany that the man he really was had been thriving, invisible and unchallenged, under the very roof where she had sought safety. The fire that had consumed her world was not a sudden accident or a single act of betrayal, but a long, slow burn that had finally reached the oxygen of truth, leaving her to face the scorching reality that the person she trusted most was the primary architect of her own ruin. She was a survivor, yet she was also the primary victim of a betrayal so profound that it shattered the very concept of marriage, forcing her to confront the fact that evil does not always wear horns or hide in the dark. Sometimes it wears a police uniform, speaks with a gentle, reassuring voice, and eats breakfast with you every single day. Rachel lay in the darkness, her eyes fixed on the ceiling, replaying years of police stories. She remembered the late nights, the times he claimed he was called in to testify, the moments he returned home with that specific, cold intensity in his eyes. She realized now that those weren't the signs of a hard-working officer burdened by the grittiness of the job. Those were the signs of a man returning from a hunt. Every time she had comforted him, every time she had listened to him complain about his supervisors or the difficult people he dealt with on patrol, she had been unwittingly helping him maintain his cover. She had been the unwitting accomplice to his crimes simply by being his wife, by providing the suburban domesticity that allowed him to project the image of a stable, respectable family man. The physical sensation of his presence in the bed beside her became unbearable. She could hear his breathing, steady and rhythmic, the breathing of a man who slept with the untroubled conscience of a sociopath. It was a rhythmic reminder of how deep the deception went. How many of those nights had he come home with the scent of his victim still clinging to him, or the adrenaline of his abuse still coursing through his veins? The thought made her skin crawl, a primal reaction to the knowledge that she had been intimately close to a monster. She looked at his hand resting on the duvet, a hand she had held, a hand that had helped raise their children, and she saw it with new eyes. It was a weapon. It was an instrument of pain. It was the hand of a man who had used the law to violate the weak. She thought of the children sleeping in the rooms down the hall. They were the most vulnerable of all. They had been raised by a father they thought was a hero, a man who represented order and justice. What would happen to them when they learned the truth? What would happen to their understanding of their father, of their family, and of the world? Rachel felt a surge of maternal panic, a protective instinct so sharp and sudden that it nearly brought her to her feet. She had to protect them from the fallout. She had to build a wall between their innocence and the toxic reality of their father's life. But how do you explain to a child that their father is a criminal? How do you explain that the person who was supposed to be their greatest source of stability was, in reality, the most unstable influence in their lives? The house felt like a tomb. It was a space defined by his secrets, and now those secrets were suffocating her. She moved her legs carefully, afraid that even the sound of the sheets shifting might wake him, might break the fragile, hateful silence of the room. She felt like an intruder in her own home, a prisoner in a life she had once chosen. She realized then that there was no normal to return to. That life had been incinerated. The man beside her had not just betrayed her. He had decimated her identity. He had turned her into a participant in his madness. The internal collapse was absolute. She thought about her childhood, the constant moving, the lack of a permanent place to call home, the desperate need for a family unit that would never leave her. She had built that home on the foundation of Sergio, and in doing so, she had built it on shifting sand. She had been so desperate to belong that she had ignored the signs. She had looked past the lack of affection, the anger, the police culture justifications, all because she couldn't afford to see the truth. The truth would have meant the loss of her dream, and she had spent 18 years refusing to acknowledge that the dream was actually a prison. Now, as the moonlight cast long, skeletal shadows across the room, she understood the cost of her denial. She had sacrificed her instincts on the altar of her own needs. She had silenced her own intuition to keep the peace. And for what? For a house of cards that was destined to fall the moment the truth surfaced. She was not just a victim of Sergio's crimes. She was a victim of her own hope. And that realization was the most painful of all. She had wanted to believe in him so badly that she had blinded herself to the monster. She turned her head slightly to look at him. In the dim light, he looked like the man she had married, large, handsome, familiar. But the image was a lie. The brain knows what the eyes refuse to see, and her brain was currently recategorizing every memory she had of him. She saw the moments of kindness as manipulative tactics. She saw the moments of passion as displays of power. She saw the entire 18-year history of their marriage as a long, meticulously staged operation. The horror of it was not in the magnitude of his crimes, but in the intimacy of his deception. He hadn't just lied to the public. He had lied to his own children. He had lied to his own wife. He had lived an entire lifetime of falsehoods, and he had done it with such ease that it defied comprehension. She closed her eyes, trying to force herself to breathe, trying to steady the frantic beating of her heart. She was a woman in a house of horrors, and the most frightening thing was that she still had to get up in the morning, make breakfast, and pretend that the world hadn't ended. She had to keep the mask on for the kids. She had to be the steady mother while the world around her was burning. It was the ultimate test of her strength, the final, most grueling act of the performance she had been forced into. And as the first hint of gray light began to bleed into the sky outside the window, Rachel knew that while the night was ending, the true nightmare was only just beginning. She would survive this, she told herself, not because of him but in spite of him. She would reclaim the house, the children, and the life he had tried to colonize with his depravity. She would be the one to survive the fire. The descent into the abyss was not a sudden plunge, but a slow, suffocating immersion, like being dragged down by a current that looked calm on the surface but was turbulent and deadly underneath. For Rachel, the days following the shattering epiphany became a surreal, dissociative experience. She lived her life in two distinct, clashing realities: the visible, mundane world of parenting, household management, and neighborly interactions, and the hidden subterranean world of terror that had suddenly revealed itself in the hollow eyes of her husband. She moved through her home like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by the carpet, her hands constantly busy with the chores that had once defined her identity as a domestic anchor. She cooked, she cleaned, she helped with homework, and she smiled when required, but every action was a performance. A carefully calibrated mask designed to keep the crumbling structure of their lives from collapsing before she could find an exit strategy. Every interaction with Sergio felt like a high-stakes negotiation with a predator who was unaware that his prey had finally woken up. When he walked through the door, the sound of his heavy boots on the hardwood was no longer the rhythmic comfort of a returning partner. It was the rhythmic reminder of a hunter returning from the field. She watched him, his posture, the way he moved through the rooms, the way he interacted with their children, and she was struck by the chilling banality of his evil. He was a man who could discuss the trivialities of a weekend plan with the same ease he presumably used to intimidate a terrified woman in the dark. He was a master of masks, a shapeshifter who could seamlessly toggle between the role of the devoted father and the architect of atrocities. This duality, once something she had naively admired as professional strength, was now the most nauseating aspect of his character. She wondered, in the quiet moments of the night, if he was truly human at all, or if he was simply a void, an absence of light that had taken the shape of a man to facilitate his hunger. The psychological toll of maintaining this charade was immense. She felt as though she were living in a glass house that was being pelted with stones from the inside. She was constantly analyzing her own behavior, second-guessing every word she spoke, and living in a state of hypervigilance that drained every ounce of her nervous energy. If she was too quiet, would he become suspicious? If she was too affectionate, would she feel like she was betraying herself? If she asked too many questions about his shift, would she trigger his anger? It was a paralyzing, toxic game of cat and mouse where she was the mouse, but the cat was the man she was still legally, socially, and emotionally bound to. She felt the heavy, physical presence of his history pressing down on her, the weight of the secrets he kept in the pockets of his uniforms, in the history of his patrol car, and in the dark, silent places of his mind. She began to look back at the early years of their marriage, trying to identify the moments where the rot had first taken hold. She remembered the strange, detached way he had behaved after they moved to the ranch in Nevada, the sudden shifts in his mood, the inexplicable anger he would direct at her, and the way he would disappear for hours on end, claiming he was out checking the property or dealing with work issues. At the time, she had blamed her own insecurities, her own need for validation as an adopted child who had never truly felt at home. She had been so afraid of abandonment that she had allowed herself to be gaslit, accepting his apologies, his gifts, and his reassurances as proof of his devotion. Now she realized that those moments of disconnection were not manifestations of his stress or his personality quirks. They were the early experiments of a man who was learning how to compartmentalize his life, learning how to compartmentalize his victims, and learning how to use his power to get away with the unthinkable. The memory of the Kate incident, which she had pushed into the deep, dark corners of her mind, returned with a visceral intensity that made her physically ill. She had been so sure of his innocence then, so quick to take his side, and so eager to believe that he was the victim of someone else's malice. She had stood by him while he painted Kate as the aggressor, and she had internalized his narrative, making it her own. Now the realization that he had likely targeted Kate in the same way he had targeted the others was a heavy, suffocating blanket of shame. She had been his shield. She had been the instrument of his legitimacy. The realization that she had been used to silence his victims, even unknowingly, was a trauma that she knew would require a lifetime to fully unpack. It was a betrayal of her own values, a violation of her own integrity, and the thought that she had protected the man who was actively destroying other women's lives was a burden that she could barely carry. She began to notice the small, insignificant details that she had ignored for years. The way he kept his phone locked with a password she was never allowed to know, the way he would suddenly become silent whenever the topic of his work shifted toward anything remotely specific, the way he would look at other women in public, not with a look of casual interest, but with a predatory, possessive focus that she had once misread as simple attraction. It was all there, the evidence of his true nature, sitting right in front of her for 18 years, hidden in plain sight. It was as if she had been living in a museum of his crimes, and only now, after the lights had been turned on, was she able to see the grotesque nature of the exhibits. She started to keep a journal, but she was terrified to keep it in the house. She would write down snippets of the truth in her mind, repeating them to herself like a mantra, ensuring that she wouldn't slip back into the trap of believing his lies. He is a predator. He is a liar. He is not the man he pretends to be. He has harmed women. He is dangerous. She had to remind herself of these facts, because she knew how easily she could be swayed by the normalcy of their life, by the familiarity of their routines, and by the desperate, clinging part of her that still wanted to believe the story was a misunderstanding. She had to be her own counselor, her own lawyer, and her own witness, because she knew that if she broke, if she showed even the slightest hint of her realization, he would not hesitate to destroy her as well. She had seen the way he looked at the world, and she knew he was a man who viewed people as objects to be used, discarded, and if they became a problem, eliminated. The fear of what he might be capable of doing to her, or to their children, was the primary motivation for her silence. She was living with a man who had the training, the skills, and the mindset to commit terrible acts, and the thought that he could turn that violence toward his own family if he felt cornered was a terrifying reality she had to manage. She played the part of the devoted, supportive wife because it was the only way to keep the peace, the only way to keep their children safe, and the only way to prepare for her departure. She was in a holding pattern, waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity, and the right level of psychological fortification to make her move. She was the captain of a sinking ship, and her only goal was to get the lifeboats into the water before the vessel disappeared beneath the waves. Every night was a battle for her soul. She would lie next to him, feeling the cold, clinical rhythm of his heart, and she would contemplate the sheer, terrifying scale of his deception. How could a person live like this? How could a human being look at their own children and know that they were capable of destroying the very world they lived in? She realized that he was a man who lived without a conscience, a man who saw no morality beyond the pursuit of his own desires. And the tragedy for Rachel was that she had been the primary victim of that lack of morality. She had given him the best of her life, the most vulnerable parts of her identity, and she had watched as he systematically ignored, abused, and exploited them. She was losing her ability to distinguish between the past and the present, the truth and the lie. She felt like she was trapped in a hall of mirrors, where every reflection was a distortion of the person she had been, and the person she was becoming. She was the woman who loved her husband, and she was the woman who despised him. She was the woman who believed in family, and she was the woman who understood that her family was a lie. She was the woman who had sought to build a foundation, and she was the woman who had realized that her house was built on a graveyard. And through it all, she was the woman who was trying to keep her sanity, to keep her children, and to keep the pieces of her life from being scattered to the wind. The only thing that kept her going was the thought of the future. Not the future she had imagined for them, but the future she would build for herself and her children. She imagined a life that was quiet, honest, and free. She imagined a house where the doors didn't have to be locked to keep the threat out, and where the silence wasn't filled with the poison of his secrets. She imagined a life where she was the one who defined her reality, and where her identity wasn't tied to the lies of a predator. She clung to this vision of a future with a fierce, unwavering determination, using it as the fuel for her survival. She was the architect of a new life, and she was going to build it out of the ruins of the old one, no matter what it cost. And as she looked out the window at the quiet, peaceful street, she felt the first faint stirrings of hope, a quiet, resolute hope that one day, this nightmare would be nothing more than a memory, and she would finally be the woman she was always meant to be. The fire was still burning, the ship was still sinking, but she was already preparing to swim, and she knew that she would make it to the other side. The portrait of Rachel Shubin, the woman who would eventually become the architect of her own liberation, was defined by an almost desperate, unwavering commitment to the concept of home. After a childhood spent navigating the fluid, often impersonal boundaries of foster care and temporary arrangements, a world where love was a currency that could be withdrawn at any moment, Rachel had cultivated a singular burning ambition: to build a sanctuary. She was not seeking the gilded cages of wealth or the transient applause of professional acclaim. She was seeking the quiet, enduring normalcy of a life anchored by love, reliability, and the permanence of shared history. To the outside world, she was a soft-spoken, nurturing woman, the kind of person who invested her energy into the well-being of those around her, often at the expense of her own needs. When she managed the local gift shop, she did so with a meticulous attention to detail, creating a space of comfort and aesthetic order that served as a mirror for the internal peace she was working so hard to construct within her own walls. In the early years of her marriage to Sergio, Rachel was the emotional ballast of the union. She was the one who planned, who dreamed, and who smoothed over the rough edges of their daily reality with an optimistic grace that seemed to defy the cynicism of the world. She viewed her role as the nurturer, a woman whose duty was to build up the man she loved, to overlook his minor flaws, and to provide the stability he claimed to crave. She was deeply, almost painfully empathetic, frequently projecting her own desire for goodness and morality onto Sergio. She operated under the dangerous assumption that because she felt love, loyalty, and empathy so profoundly, he must possess those same bedrock virtues. It was a projection that would eventually become her greatest vulnerability, a blind spot that allowed her to ignore the coldness she occasionally glimpsed in his eyes or the jarring distance he maintained during their most intimate moments. Rachel lived by a code of radical loyalty. To her, a vow was not merely a ceremonial recitation of words. It was a pact, a binding agreement that held the chaos of the world at bay. When the first whispers of accusations regarding his conduct at work began to surface years before the full sickening reality was exposed, Rachel's instinct was not to question, but to defend. Her entire identity was predicated on the idea that they were a team, a single unbreakable unit. She was a person who took profound responsibility for the health of her relationships, often internalizing the blame for his professional stumbles or his emotional unavailability, convinced that if she just improved her own behavior, she could anchor him. She was the definition of an optimist, choosing to interpret Sergio's lack of affection as a personal quirk or a result of his stressful schedule, rather than as a fundamental deficit of the heart. She was inherently trusting, a trait born of her childhood hunger to finally have someone to trust, to have a name that was her own, and a family that was permanent. The idea that someone could be fundamentally off, that a person could be a shell of a human being, devoid of empathy and capable of profound, calculated malice, was a concept that simply did not exist in Rachel's moral framework. She believed in the redemptive power of love, the transformative nature of marriage, and the sanctity of the family unit. When they married in 1999 and subsequently welcomed their children, Rachel's portrait shifted from that of a searching, idealistic girl to a fiercely devoted, protective mother. Her identity became entirely intertwined with the well-being of her children. She was the one who stood in the kitchen at dawn, who managed the chaotic, swirling realities of a household, and who navigated the complexities of raising a family while her husband navigated the high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled world of policing. She was the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of their home, the person who kept the windows clean and the doors locked, never suspecting that the greatest threat to that home was the one she had let in willingly, with open arms. There was a profound, quiet strength in Rachel that even the later chaos of her life could not destroy. It was the resilience of a woman who had been conditioned by her upbringing to be adaptable, to move on, and to keep going despite the lack of a permanent foundation. She was humble, not in the sense of being meek or subservient, but in the sense of being grounded in the simple, real things of life. A warm meal, a healthy child, a quiet afternoon. She was a woman who didn't ask for much, which made her the ideal target for a man like Sergio, who was accustomed to taking everything. Her humility, her lack of ego, and her deep-seated need for connection were exactly the things he exploited to keep her trapped in a reality of his own design. As the years passed, the gap between the woman Rachel was and the woman Sergio was destroying grew wider, creating a psychological tension that she masked with increasingly fragile layers of domestic order. She was becoming more tired, more burdened by the secrets and the unexplained tensions of their marriage, yet she maintained a poise that spoke to her profound dedication. She was a woman who had given 18 years of her youth to the dream of a perfect family, a monumental investment of time, emotion, and hope that she protected with every ounce of her spirit. She was the heart of the home, a person whose capacity for forgiveness was, tragically, the very thing that kept her tethered to a narrative of her own making. She was the light in the dark, a woman who believed that if she just worked hard enough, if she was just loyal enough, and if she was just good enough, she could keep the shadows at bay. She never realized that she had been living with the source of the darkness all along, and that the very light she was trying to protect was being consumed by the man she had sworn to love. She was the victim of her own nobility, a woman who deserved the stability she had fought so hard to provide, only to be forced to watch it all burn under the heat of a predator's secret life. The irony was devastating. The man she chose as her savior, the man who wore the uniform of a hero, was the man who had stolen her peace, her history, and her sense of self. Throughout these 18 years she lived in a state of suspended reality, a purgatory of her own making. She was so focused on building the perfect home that she didn't realize the walls were being built of lies. She looked at the photos of their family, the portraits on the mantel, and she saw a testament to their union, not realizing they were merely props in an elaborate play. In those quiet, agonizing hours after the children were asleep, Rachel would sit in the living room, listening to the silence of the house. It was a silence she had worked so hard to create, a peaceful, ordered, and safe space, but now it felt heavy with the weight of the unknown. She felt like an intruder in her own life, a woman who had played a role so well that she had forgotten who she was before the play began. She wondered where the girl who had wanted to build a sanctuary had gone. Was she lost, or was she simply waiting in the wings, buried under 18 years of domestic servitude to a man she never truly knew? This is the tragedy of Rachel Shubin, that her capacity for love, her yearning for connection, and her commitment to the family unit were the exact tools used to break her. She was a woman who had so much to give, and she gave it all to a void that could never be filled. She stood in the center of the life she had built, a woman surrounded by the fruits of her own labor, only to realize that the garden was poisoned from the roots up. She had been the architect of a beautiful structure, and in the end she would have to be the one to watch it fall, to tear it down, and to walk out into the cold, uncertain air of a world that she had once been so afraid of. She was a survivor in waiting, a woman whose true strength was yet to be tested, but who, even in her darkest hours, held on to the small flickering flame of hope, a hope that one day, the truth would set her free, and she would finally be the woman she was always meant to be, independent, resilient, and entirely her own. The transition from the sanctuary of domesticity to the suffocating, claustrophobic reality of a criminal investigation did not happen as a singular event. It was a slow, agonizing erosion of the world Rachel Alvarez had spent nearly 2 decades curating. By the spring of 2012, the atmosphere within their home had shifted from a place of shelter to a pressure cooker of unspoken dread and heavy, vibrating secrets. The air in the house seemed permanently stale, thickened by the weight of things left unsaid, and the impossible-to-ignore intuition that her life was balancing on the edge of a precipice. The facade of the hero police officer, a label that had once been a source of immense pride for Rachel, had begun to crack, revealing the jagged, ugly inconsistencies beneath the surface of Sergio's existence. Rachel had learned, through years of subtle psychological conditioning, to navigate the mercurial temperament of a man who was mean, a man who baited her into arguments until she was left trembling and apologetic for things she had never done. She had lived with the man who had cheated on her, breaking her heart in ways that left permanent scars, yet she had consistently chosen to stay, clinging to the fragments of the family unit like a sailor clutching a piece of driftwood in the middle of a violent, unforgiving ocean. She believed, with a tragic, naive sincerity that she now recognized as a form of self-sabotage, that her loyalty could be the force that finally anchored him. She thought that if she was patient enough, if she was kind enough, and if she was good enough, the man she had married would finally emerge from the shadow of his own darkness. She was, in essence, holding the door open for a ghost. Then came the September afternoon that shattered the remaining glass. Sergio walked through the front door, not with the booming, confident presence of a man returning from a long shift, but with a hollow, diminished energy that drained the room of its remaining warmth. He walked over to the kitchen counter, opened his wallet, and Rachel saw it immediately, the rectangular, leather-bound indentation where his badge belonged now empty. The silence that followed was heavy, a vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. When he finally confessed that he was on paid administrative leave, the excuse rolled off his tongue with a practiced, rehearsed ease. A woman he had encountered on patrol had accused him of forcing himself on her, claiming he would cite her if she didn't comply. He framed it as a professional hazard, a routine, unfortunate consequence of the dangerous, thankless job he performed in the trenches of law enforcement. The association protects us from these things, he said, his voice smooth, soothing, and utterly devoid of the tremor that should have accompanied such an accusation. Rachel, desperate to maintain the sanity of her life, wanted to believe him. She wanted, with every fiber of her being, to believe that this was just another hurdle in the line of duty, a misunderstanding that would soon be cleared up by the legal machinery of the department. But the seed of doubt, planted by the infidelity years prior, had begun to sprout in the dark corners of her mind. When the unexpected, sharp, and invasive call to the station came, her heartbeat hammered against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic alarm that told her the world she knew was dying. And then the true nightmare descended. The doorbell rang, a sound she would eventually come to associate with the total annihilation of her reality, and she found herself looking out the window at a scene of military-grade precision. 6 or 7 patrol units were parked in her driveway, their lights painting the neighborhood in a rhythmic, pulsing wash of red and blue, and a swarm of investigators descended on her home with the cold, systematic efficiency of a demolition crew. She was no longer the wife of a respected officer. She was an incidental witness in a crime scene. She watched, paralyzed by a mixture of shock and dawning horror, as they moved through her house, seizing her tablets, her computers, and every device that held their digital lives. The home she had kept as a pristine sanctuary for her children had been violated, turned inside out, and laid bare for the clinical scrutiny of strangers. She felt a profound sense of terror, a raw, primal fear that chilled her blood as she watched her husband, the man who had held their children and sworn to serve the public, being treated as the target of a serious, violent, and high-stakes criminal investigation. In the weeks that followed, the house became a tomb of unanswerable questions. Sergio returned to the home, but he was a ghost, his face tight and unreadable. He told her the allegations were deeper and more numerous than he had led her to believe. They had taken his DNA. The words felt alien, cold, and final. He was a shadow in his own home, moving through the rooms like an apparition, while Rachel found herself living in a state of suspended animation. 2 months passed, an agonizingly slow, rhythmic crawl of silence and paranoia, until the night Sergio finally sat her down and initiated a confession that would be the final destructive blow to the world she had built. It wasn't just an affair, it was an addiction. He confessed to being a sex addict, to a history of multiple affairs that predated their marriage, and to the fact that the investigation against him was a massive, lethal threat that had the potential to put him away for the rest of his life. That night, Rachel didn't just feel heartbroken. She felt the scales fall from her eyes with a violence that made her head spin. She began to research sex addiction, reading the chilling clinical links between the behavior she had endured and the profiles of predatory sexual offenders. She thought back to the way he had been in the bedroom, the aggressive, forced intimacy that she had mistaken for passion or a misplaced expression of guilt. She thought back to the woman named Kate years ago, and realized with a sickening, gut-wrenching jolt that she had been lied to. Every single memory of their 18-year marriage, every touch, every kiss, every fight, every "I love you," was retroactively stained. The man she had defended, the man she had sacrificed her own needs for, was a predator who had been hiding in plain sight, using his badge as a shroud for his depravity. The realization arrived in a flash of clarity. The hero who caught the bad guys had been the worst one of all, using his authority not to protect, but to hunt. The fear that took root in her chest was no longer about the police or the looming scandal. It was about the man who was currently sleeping in the bed down the hall. She realized she was not just living with a liar. She was living with a monster who had weaponized his duty to violate the very people he had sworn to protect. The nightmare was no longer a storm outside. The fire was inside the house, and she was trapped in the center of it with her children. The transformation from a protective, loving mother into a woman plotting a desperate, life-saving escape was instantaneous. It was a primal survival instinct that overrode everything she had ever believed about love, marriage, and loyalty. She looked at her children and saw not just her family, but her responsibility. She was the only thing standing between them and the ruin that Sergio had invited into their lives. She began to observe him with a detached, chillingly objective gaze. She cataloged his movements, his phone calls, and his moods not as a wife, but as a strategist planning a retreat. The house, once the center of her universe, became a battlefield. Every drawer, every closet, every hallway was a potential trap. She had to navigate the daily routines, the meals, the school runs, the conversations, while her mind was thousands of miles away, calculating the logistics of a total permanent departure. The weight of the secret was a physical burden. She felt as though she were carrying a leaden cloak that nobody else could see, pulling her closer to the ground with every step. She had to pretend that nothing had changed, all while the foundation of her world was disintegrating. This was the true cruelty of her situation. She had to act as the stabilizing force for her family, while the ground beneath her feet was turning into quicksand. She realized that she had been living in a fabricated reality, a dollhouse that Sergio had built to keep her contained and complacent, and now the walls were finally closing in. There were moments when she almost broke, when the sheer magnitude of the betrayal threatened to overwhelm her. She would stand in the laundry room, gripping the edge of the dryer, trying to hold back the screams that built up in her throat. She had to be strong not for him but for the future she was desperately trying to preserve. She started to prepare slowly and methodically. She gathered documents, she secured a secondary bank account, and she began to make quiet, invisible plans for an exit that could not be traced. She was a woman in exile while still living in the house of her captor. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation outside grew louder and more pervasive. The news of the investigation began to leak into the community, and the walls of the house seemed to shrink even further. The phone would ring with anonymous callers. The neighbors looked at their house with a mixture of curiosity and judgment, and the sense of isolation became total. Rachel felt as though she were living in the eye of a hurricane, waiting for the final catastrophic wind to come and sweep the rest of her life away. She was exhausted, terrified, and fundamentally altered, yet she was also, for the first time in 18 years, entirely clear-sighted. She no longer had the luxury of hope, and she certainly didn't have the luxury of fear. She only had the necessity of action. The man who slept beside her was no longer her husband. He was a problem to be solved, a threat to be managed, and a barrier to be overcome. She looked at him and saw not the man she had loved, but the sum of his crimes. Every gesture, every word, every smile was just another piece of data in the case she was building in her own mind, the case for her own survival. She was readying herself to walk away from the only life she had known, to sacrifice the home she had built, and to become a ghost in her own life, if that was what it took to lead her children into the light. The fire was no longer something she could contain or extinguish. It was something she had to escape, and she was already moving one measured, calculated step at a time, toward the horizon of her own salvation. The nightmare of the last 18 years was ending, not with a whisper, but with the quiet, determined resolution of a woman who had finally decided that the cost of her freedom was worth any price she had to pay. The revelation that the house she had meticulously built over 18 years was, in truth, a meticulously maintained cage, acted upon Rachel like a blinding, searing flash of lightning that illuminated the darkest corners of her existence. The transition from the paralyzing shock of Sergio's confession to the cold, lethal necessity of action was instantaneous, triggered by a primal instinct to protect the only things in her world that remained untainted, her children. In that moment of absolute, heart-shattering clarity, Rachel stopped playing the role of the devoted, conciliatory wife, the woman who had spent nearly 2 decades smoothing over the rough edges of her husband's monstrous duality, and began to operate with the clinical, precise detachment of a survivor. The mask she had worn for years, the one that projected the image of a contented, supportive partner, did not shatter. It simply slid off, revealing a woman beneath who possessed a resolve she had not known she held. She looked at her children, the little ones who had been carefully shielded from the suffocating dark truth of their father's graveyard shift, and realized that the house had become a ticking time bomb. The silence in the home, once a comfort, a symbol of their domestic stability, now felt like the held, bated breath of a predator waiting for the exact moment to strike. Every room, every piece of furniture, every photograph on the wall was tainted by the knowledge that they were bought and maintained with the currency of atrocities. The space she had crafted as a refuge was now a prison of secrets, and she was the warden of a reality that was actively consuming her from the inside out. Every interaction with Sergio became a calculated, high-stakes performance. She had to mask the deep, visceral revulsion that clawed at her throat whenever he entered a room, a feeling that had become a constant, physical presence in her body. She had to pretend to be the woman he still thought he could manipulate, the woman he believed would remain anchored to the domestic routine, all while her mind was racing through the impossibly complex logistics of an escape that would have to be invisible, silent, and permanent. How do you walk away from 18 years of building 3 children, and a life woven into the very fabric of a community, and yet how do you stay for one more second when the man beside you is a predator whose badge is a shroud for his crimes? The fear was a constant, heavy weight in her chest, a tremor in her hands that she had to suppress with agonizing effort, but she buried it beneath a layer of resolve that was forged in the furnace of her betrayal. She began to pack in small, imperceptible increments. She moved clothing, documents, and keepsakes to a hidden location, treating each item as a piece of evidence in the story of her own liberation. She became an expert at reading Sergio's moods, mapping his patrol schedules, and calculating the exact windows of time when she could operate without his surveillance. It was a game of cat and mouse, and for the first time in her life she was the one who was leading the movement. Every smile she offered him, every conversation she engaged in, and every domestic ritual she performed was a tactical maneuver in the service of their survival. She felt like a spy in her own life, a woman observing the enemy from the inside, gathering the strength and the resources to strike for her own freedom. The morning of January 3, 2013 dawned crisp and clear, a day that appeared deceptively normal to the rest of the world. The air outside was cold, and the morning light filtered through the windows with a clinical, unblinking intensity. Rachel told Sergio she was taking the children out for the day, a standard, domestic errand that triggered no alarm bells in the mind of a man who had become dangerously arrogant in his own deception. He believed, as he had for 18 years, that his narrative was the only one that mattered, that his control over the household was absolute and unquestionable. As she pulled out of the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath the tires of her car, she did not look back. She didn't head toward the stores, the parks, or the school. She began a journey of flight, an escape that would eventually take her thousands of miles away to the safety and the anonymity of Florida. The drive was a blur of high-stakes anxiety, a journey where every mile was a victory and every car that pulled up behind her was a potential threat. Every siren she heard in the distance, every flashing light, and every sudden shift in the traffic made her heart hammer against her ribs, a frantic, rhythmic reminder that she was fleeing from the very organization she had once trusted to protect the world. She was not just running away from a man. She was running away from the entire reality she had once deemed perfect. She was a woman in exile, stripped of the home she had crafted with such care, but for the first time in her marriage, she was also truly terrifyingly free. She wasn't just escaping a predator. She was running toward the reclamation of her own soul. As she drove across the vast, unforgiving expanse of the country, she felt the miles stretching out behind her, a physical manifestation of the distance she was placing between her children and the monster they had called Dad. She was a woman who had been stripped of her history, forced to reinvent herself in the span of a single desperate motion. The fear was a constant, but it was now a focused, sharp, and useful fear, a fuel that propelled her toward the horizon. She spent the long, lonely hours of the drive constructing a narrative for her children, a story that would explain their sudden departure without shattering their understanding of the world. She was the architect of their future, the silent protector of their innocence, and the single enduring point of stability in their rapidly shifting reality. Behind her, in the quiet, empty rooms of the house she had vacated, the walls finally began to close in on Sergio. 2 months after her departure, the investigative machinery that had been grinding away in the background, a relentless, systematic process of collecting and verifying evidence, finally reached its lethal, inevitable apex. Sergio Alvarez was indicted on 35 felony counts. The charges were a grotesque, horrifying litany of violence: aggravated kidnapping, rape, sexual penetration, and oral copulation by use of authority and duress. As the news hit the airwaves, the community of West Sacramento was thrown into a state of collective, horrified disbelief. The man who had been their protector, the one they saw patrolling the streets at night, the man who had been their neighbor, their friend, and their colleague, was revealed to be a hunter of the most insidious, cold-blooded kind. Investigators began to stitch together the harrowing reality of his graveyard shift, uncovering a pattern that was as chilling as it was calculated. He hadn't been catching bad guys. He had been selecting victims, women he deemed vulnerable, women he felt he could silence with the weight of his badge, his uniform, and the implicit threat of incarceration. He would check the system for active warrants, identifying names of women who had no choice but to comply, and then he would lure them into his patrol car. He would drive them to remote, wooded lots or back alleys, places where the silence was heavy, the shadows were deep, and help was non-existent. There he would violate them with the casual, terrifying cruelty of a man who believed he was entirely untouchable. The reports that eventually came to light painted a portrait of a man who had completely snapped, a man who saw his uniform not as a tool of service but as a license for atrocity. For Rachel, reading the details as they emerged, the sickness was profound. She felt the physical echoes of his violence in the space she had shared with him, the lingering toxic residue of his presence in the very rooms where she had tried to raise her children. The investigation eventually linked him to 5 more victims, women whose stories were as harrowing as they were consistent. The sex addiction he had used as a shield, the narrative he had spun to explain away his behavior, was now revealed for what it truly was: the predatory behavior of a man who had been using his power to feed a depraved, bottomless hunger. The mask was not just off, it was burned to ash, and the man who had been the pillar of her existence was now exposed as the very definition of a monster. She sat in her new quiet life in Florida, miles away from the wreckage of the life she had left behind, and she finally allowed herself to breathe. She was a woman who had walked through the fire, felt the heat, and emerged with the clarity to understand exactly what she had survived. The house in West Sacramento was silent, the rooms were empty, and the man who had occupied them was now a prisoner of his own actions. The nightmare had concluded, and for the first time she was breathing for herself, and only for herself. She had reclaimed her life, her children, and the future he had tried to colonize with his depravity. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor who had constructed her own salvation, and she knew with an unshakable, permanent certainty that she was finally, fully, and irrevocably free. The trial of Sergio Alvarez in February 2014 was not merely a judicial proceeding. It was the public autopsy of a life built upon a foundation of calculated, systematic lies. As Rachel sat in the spectators' gallery, she felt like an archaeologist excavating the ruins of her own past, forced to stare at the artifacts of a monster who had once shared her bed and helped raise her children. The courtroom, a sterile, high-ceiling space of polished wood and harsh fluorescent light, seemed to vibrate with the collective trauma of the women whose lives had been irrevocably altered by the man sitting at the defense table. Sergio, stripped of the uniform that had once granted him his intoxicating, illicit power, looked small, withered, and hauntingly mundane. The homecoming king, the respected officer, the pillar of the community, these personas had evaporated under the clinical, pitiless glare of the prosecution's evidence. The defense had attempted to weave a narrative of misunderstanding and consensual interactions, relying on the classic toxic toolkit of the predator, gaslighting, victim blaming, and the invocation of the disgruntled citizen defense. They tried to paint the victims as unreliable, as individuals whose past entanglements with the law made their testimony inherently suspect. It was a desperate, grasping tactic that leaned heavily on the very same power structures Sergio had exploited for years. They were banking on the assumption that the jury would naturally favor the word of a man in uniform over the word of the marginalized. However, the prosecution had constructed a fortress of facts that was impervious to such maneuvers. They did not just present accusations, they presented a digital and forensic footprint so dense and damning that it rendered the defense's rhetoric hollow. The testimonies of the survivors were the emotional and moral center of the trial. One by one, these women took the stand, their voices initially brittle and faint, like glass about to shatter, but growing stronger as they recounted the events that had haunted their waking hours and invaded their dreams for years. They spoke of the sudden blinding flash of the patrol car's lights, the rhythmic tap on the window, the authoritative command that made their blood run cold, and the terrifying coercive drive to the desolate, wooded outskirts of the city, places where the city's lights could not reach and where the badge served as the only law. Their accounts were not disparate, isolated experiences. They were terrifyingly, chillingly consistent. They detailed the way Sergio had weaponized the legal system, checking their names against active warrants to identify those who would be too terrified of the authorities to ever come forward. He wasn't just committing crimes. He was weaponizing justice itself, turning the instruments of public safety into the implements of his own dark desires. Rachel watched them, her heart hammering against her ribs, feeling a profound, nauseating sense of complicity, even though she knew intellectually that she had been as much a victim of his deception as anyone else. She saw in their faces the fear she had felt when she first realized the truth. She saw the exhaustion of women who had carried the burden of a secret they were never supposed to tell. She felt a sickening shock as the details were recounted, the sheer, casual cruelty of his actions, the way he could switch from the man who came home to tuck his children into bed to the man who violated strangers in the back of a patrol car. The disconnect was so vast, so profound, that it felt as though she were living in two worlds at once. The world of the courtroom where the reality was laid bare, and the world of her own memory, where the lie had once felt like home. The sense of nausea was constant, a lingering acidic presence that kept her tethered to the reality of the courtroom floor for 2 weeks of agonizing testimony. The forensic evidence was the final insurmountable wall that Sergio could not scale. The DNA evidence, the digital logs from the patrol database, the GPS coordinates from his car. They all locked together like the teeth of a giant inescapable gear. Every story told by a victim was backed by the cold, scientific confirmation of his presence and his violence. The defense team's arguments about consent crumbled when confronted with the reality of the patrol logs, which proved he had systematically targeted these women, that he had checked them in the system, and that he had diverted his patrol to intercept them. It was not a series of unfortunate encounters. It was a hunting strategy. When the digital evidence was displayed on the large screens in the courtroom, the maps, the timestamps, the logs of his searches, the courtroom fell into an absolute vacuum-like silence. It was as if the ghosts of every woman who had been silenced by his badge were finally, irrevocably, given a voice. For 9 days, the jury deliberated. During those days, the atmosphere in the courthouse was thick with a tension that was almost palpable. Rachel found herself in a strange state of limbo, walking through the corridors of the building like a phantom, her identity shifting from the wife of the defendant to the primary witness to his true nature. She thought of the 18 years she had spent in the shadow of a man who was in fact a literal nightmare. She thought of the loyalty she had given him, the trust she had placed in him, and the way he had utilized her very existence as a mask to conduct his atrocities. She realized that every sacrifice she had made, every moment of domestic compromise, every argument she had lost, had been used as fuel for his depravity. She felt a cold, final clarity. She had been the primary victim of the performance, the woman who had nurtured the very person who had done the most to destroy her. When the jury returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed. The air felt heavy, stagnant, and electrically charged. As the foreman stood up, the silence was absolute. A void where every breath felt loud. Guilty, guilty, guilty. The word was read out 25 times, a thunderclap that echoed through the halls of justice and rattled the very foundations of the community. Sergio Alvarez was found guilty of 25 felony counts, including rape, oral copulation by duress, and aggravated kidnapping. When the final count was read, there was a collective ragged exhale from the gallery, a sound that contained the grief, the rage, and the profound aching relief of those who had waited so long for this moment. Sergio, for his part, remained stone-faced, his eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, as if he were observing a life that had nothing to do with his own. The sentencing phase, occurring shortly after, was the definitive conclusion to the era of his influence. The judge, a woman whose voice was steady, resonant, and devoid of ambiguity, handed down a sentence of 205 years. It was a thunderous declaration that he would never again walk free, never again hold authority, and never again be able to weaponize his existence against others. The sentence was not merely a punishment for the crimes. It was an acknowledgement of the total irrevocable destruction he had wreaked on the lives of his victims. It was a symbolic end to the myth of the hero officer, a definitive statement that the system he had manipulated was finally capable of holding him to account. For Rachel, the sentencing felt like the final closing of a heavy, iron door on a chapter of her life that had almost cost her everything. As she listened to the judge speak the numbers, 205 years, She realized that for the man who had been the absolute center of her world, that was effectively his life. She thought of the uniform, the power he had abused, and the way he had used it to tear apart the lives of innocent women, and she felt a chilling final clarity. He hadn't just snapped, as some might have wanted to believe. This was a rupture that revealed the rot that had been there all along, a darkness that had been present, hidden, and growing for the entirety of their marriage. The courtroom emptied out, a slow, somber procession of lawyers, bailiffs, and spectators, leaving the echoes of the trial to settle into the walls. Rachel remained for a moment, sitting in the hard, wooden pew, looking at the empty defense table. She was no longer a witness to his crimes. She was a survivor of his existence. As she walked out of the courthouse, the cold air of the California afternoon felt different, sharper, cleaner, and finally, untainted by the presence of the man who had stolen her reality. She was finally breathing for herself, and only for herself. The nightmare had concluded, the monster was behind bars, and the path forward, while still steep and uncertain, was finally hers to navigate. She didn't look back. She walked toward the parking lot, her footsteps light, her heart heavy but healing, knowing that the most important journey, the reclamation of her own identity, was only just beginning. She had been the wife of a monster, but she would die as the woman who had survived him. The breakthrough that finally dismantled the myth of the hero officer was not a single cinematic moment, but a grueling multi-layered accumulation of data and courage that stripped Sergio's armor away, layer by agonizing layer. For 18 years, he had operated with the terrifying, unearned arrogance of a man who believed the system he worked for, the blue wall of silence, the institutional deference to the badge, would always provide him with an impenetrable shield. He had relied on the absolute, foundational assumption that as a police officer, his word was the baseline of truth, and that any accusation leveled against him would be treated as an anomaly, a statistical outlier caused by disgruntled citizens, misunderstandings, or the inherent instability of the people he encountered on his patrol. This arrogance, however, was fundamentally flawed. The true breakthrough occurred only when the investigators shifted their gaze, stopping the practice of viewing his incidents as isolated, disparate events and beginning to overlay them, effectively creating a map of predation that revealed a clear, unmistakable pattern of criminal behavior that defied any narrative of professional error. The pivotal shift in the entire investigation was the collective decision to treat the accusations not as police work gone wrong, but as a series of calculated, serial offenses. Detectives began the laborious process of systematically checking the patrol logs against the database inquiries he had made during his shifts. The correlation was damning, a mathematical refutation of his innocence. They discovered with a growing sense of horror that he wasn't just patrolling, he was actively hunting. He would log into the system, cross-reference names, and specifically target women who had active warrants or prior entanglements with the law. This wasn't professional duty. It was a targeted selection process, the behavior of an apex predator who possessed the technical knowledge to identify victims who were the least likely to be believed by the justice system. This discovery was the definitive aha moment for the prosecution, the empirical proof that his entire professional persona was merely a carefully maintained mask for a systematic long-term campaign of sexual violence. The inclusion of the victims' voices was the second, and perhaps most critical breakthrough in the process of dismantling his power. For years, these women had been paralyzed by terror, silenced by the very badge that Sergio wore like a holy talisman. They lived in a state of perpetual vibrating fear that if they complained, the police would retaliate, or that their own past mistakes, the very things that had made them vulnerable in the first place, would be used to bury their credibility. The breakthrough came when investigators, bolstered by the mounting forensic evidence, were finally able to assure these women that they were not alone, and that the system, for once, was working for them. When the first woman finally came forward and recounted her harrowing story, being driven to a remote, wooded lot and coerced into sexual favors under the direct, credible threat of immediate arrest, the floodgates opened. Her testimony provided the missing narrative thread that connected the cold, hard forensic evidence to the living, breathing human tragedy, effectively turning a series of abstract statistics into an undeniable, harrowing case for justice. For Rachel, the breakthrough was internal, agonizing, and fundamentally transformative. Throughout the initial stages of the investigation, She had been grappling with a distorted, vestigial sense of loyalty, a residue of the 18 years she had invested in the man he pretended to be. The breakthrough in her own mind came when she stopped trying to fix the marriage, stopped trying to salvage the wreckage, and started looking at the facts as a collection of clinical, indisputable truths. When she finally read the files, the records of his movements, the timing of his crimes, and the chilling, clinical, cold-blooded nature of his interactions with those women, the last of her illusions disintegrated. She stopped seeing him as a sex addict who needed counseling and started seeing him for what he was. A man who had made a conscious, repeated choice to be evil. This was the moment the marriage died. It was the moment she stopped being a wife and started being a survivor. The breakthrough in the case was the realization that the badge didn't just give him power. It gave him the opportunity to commit crimes with near-total, institutionalized impunity. The investigators discovered that he had been hiding in plain sight, using the very structures designed to protect the public to facilitate his atrocities. He had become comfortable, sloppy, and confident that he could control every narrative he encountered. But the sheer volume of his victims, and the fact that they were all telling the same horrifying story, eventually became too large for the system to ignore. The weight of their combined testimonies created a reality that no amount of rank, history, or charm could ever hope to suppress. This breakthrough changed everything. It shifted the trial from a he said, she said domestic conflict into the prosecution of a serial predator who had committed systematic, pathological crimes. It allowed the prosecution to present a case that was not based on emotional conjecture, but on the overwhelming evidence of his consistent, compulsive behavior. The breakthrough was the end of his ability to deceive, the beginning of his accountability, and the first essential step toward Rachel reclaiming her own life from the long dark shadow he had cast over it. For the first time, the truth possessed the weight to surface, and it did so with a force that nothing, not his rank, not his charm, not his history, could ever hold back again. The case had broken through the wall of silence he had built, and for the first time, he was stripped bare and exposed as the small, cowardly, and deeply broken man he had always been. The process of dismantling him was also a process of self-reconstruction for those he had harmed. The victims, by testifying, were not just providing evidence. They were reclaiming their own autonomy, asserting that their lives had value, and that their stories were the final, absolute truth of the matter. Every day in that courtroom, the power dynamic shifted. The man who had once held absolute control over these women's lives was now subjected to their scrutiny, their testimonies, and their unwavering persistence. He was no longer the hunter. He was the subject of the investigation, the target of the evidence, and the prisoner of the very system he had once manipulated so effectively. The realization that he was vulnerable, that his actions had consequences, and that the badge was not a license for depravity, was the most devastating blow to his ego. He had operated on the assumption that he was above the law, that he was the law, but the reality of the courtroom forced him to face the fact that he was, at his core, just another individual whose actions had violated the most fundamental pact of society. The breakthrough was a victory for the rule of law, a confirmation that the systems designed to maintain order were, in fact, capable of correcting themselves, even when the rot had reached the highest levels. Rachel, sitting in the gallery, felt the weight of the years beginning to lift. She saw the man she had loved, and she saw him clearly. There was no more mystery, no more excuses, and no more questions left to answer. The truth was out, and in that truth there was a terrible, beautiful kind of finality. She knew that the path ahead would not be easy, that the trauma would always leave its mark, but she also knew that the hardest part, the part where she had to doubt her own reality, was behind her. The breakthrough had provided her with the clarity to move forward, to build a future that was not anchored to his lies, but to the truth of her own resilience. As the trial neared its conclusion, the weight of his actions became the anchor that dragged him into his own destruction. He had built a life on a foundation of sand, and now the tide of the truth was washing it all away. There was no more hiding, no more maneuvering, and no more pretending. There was only the evidence, the testimony, and the cold, hard reality of the law. He was a man who had tried to play God in the lives of the vulnerable, and in the end, he was revealed to be nothing more than a small, broken individual who had chosen a path of destruction. The breakthrough had not only destroyed him, it had liberated those who had been held captive by his secrets. For the first time in 18 years, The house he had built was quiet, the secrets were silenced, and the truth was the only thing that remained standing, tall and defiant against the wreckage of his crimes. This was the breakthrough, and it was the beginning of everything. The trial in February 2014 was a grueling public deconstruction of a predator, held in a courtroom that felt perpetually cold, despite the sweltering intensity of the testimonies within. As the proceedings commenced, the air was thick with the weight of years of silenced suffering. Sergio Alvarez sat at the defense table, no longer the imposing officer in a crisp uniform, but a man in an ill-fitting suit who seemed to be shrinking into his chair as the prosecution began to methodically peel back the layers of his carefully curated life. He maintained a plea of not guilty, a final hollow stance that relied on the hope that his remaining shreds of credibility might survive the onslaught of forensic reality. He watched the jury with a calculated, flat effect, attempting to cling to the image of the misunderstood public servant, unaware that every minute of the trial was further cementing his role as the architect of his own destruction. The prosecution's case was a sledgehammer of precision. They did not rely on inflammatory language or dramatic gestures. They relied on the cold, hard logic of data and DNA. Witness after witness took the stand, their voices initially wavering with the trauma of reliving their violation, only to find strength in the shared, haunting consistency of their accounts. Each woman described the same chilling sequence: the sudden lights of the patrol car behind them, the authoritative tap on the window, the fear of the legal system, and the eventual coercive drive to some desolate, wooded periphery of the city. As their testimonies mirrored one another, the jury began to see the pattern that Sergio had believed was invisible: a map of predation that covered the dark, quiet corners of his patrol route. The courtroom became a space where the illusion of Sergio's goodness was systematically dismantled. A forensic expert presented the DNA evidence with clinical detachment, and with each presentation, the atmospheric tension in the room thickened. When the prosecution linked the physical evidence to the victims' stories, the defense's narrative of misunderstanding, or coercion by the women, simply evaporated. Rachel sat in the gallery, observing the proceedings with a stony, exhausted resolve. She watched as the man she had mothered children with was exposed for the serial violator he was, feeling a profound, nauseating clarity. Every time Sergio's eyes darted toward her, seeking the loyalty he had always exploited, she remained unmoved, a testament to the fact that his power over her had finally irrevocably ceased to exist. The most damning aspect of the trial was the exposure of his methodology. The prosecution demonstrated that he had specifically targeted women who were already struggling, individuals he deemed low risk, for reporting crimes because they had their own past entanglements with the law. This wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary lapse. It was a cold, systematic exploitation of the very legal framework he had been sworn to uphold. The jury members, many of them pillars of the community, were visibly disturbed as they realized how deep the betrayal went. The man who had been tasked with protecting the vulnerable had been, in fact, hunting them with a predator's calculated patience. When the jury finally retired to deliberate, the courthouse seemed to descend into an eerie, suspended silence. After 9 days of deliberation, the verdict was delivered with a heavy, final air of authority. 25 felony counts. As the judge read each conviction, rape, oral copulation by duress, aggravated kidnapping, the room seemed to exhale. The sentencing was the final crushing blow. 205 years. The sheer scale of the sentence acknowledged the lifelong impact of his actions on his victims and the irreparable damage he had done to the sanctity of his own home. As the bailiffs moved to lead him away, Sergio's facade finally cracked. The man who had been homecoming king, the protector, and the officer of the law was led out in handcuffs, his existence now reduced to the confines of a cell where his badge and his authority held no currency. The justice served was absolute, yet the trial left a heavy silence in its wake. It was a victory, certainly, but it was a victory bought with the currency of ruined lives and lost years. For Rachel, the conclusion of the trial felt like the final closing of a heavy iron door on a chapter that had almost cost her everything. She left the courthouse not with a sense of triumph, but with a profound, quiet sense of finality, knowing that while the justice system had punished the man, she would have to continue the work of reclaiming the woman he had tried so hard to destroy. The aftermath of the verdict was a period of surreal adjustment for Rachel. In the days following the sentencing, She felt a strange, lingering dissonance. The nightmare was officially over, yet the psychic residue of those years clung to her like a cold fog. She spent these days in the company of her children, who were beginning to process the gravity of their father's crimes. She was careful, protective, and endlessly patient, creating a safe harbor for them to land as they navigated the wreckage of their family unit. She realized that her victory was not in the judge's gavel, but in the survival of her children's empathy and their ability to see the world as something other than a predatory playground. She also found herself navigating the complexities of the public's gaze. For weeks after the trial, she was approached by media outlets, documentarians, and neighbors who wanted to know how she didn't see it. She had to learn how to deflect these inquiries without compromising her own boundaries. It was a delicate, often infuriating dance. People wanted a simple explanation, an easy way to categorize her as either a naive victim or a complicit partner, when the truth was a tangled, painful, and deeply private journey. She realized that she owed no one an explanation, and she began to craft a life that was centered entirely on her own needs rather than the expectations of the public or the reputation of the man who had abandoned them for his own dark appetites. She started small. She began to redecorate the house she was renting, replacing the furniture that reminded her of their life together, and painting the walls in colors that felt like her. It was a simple act, but it felt revolutionary. It was her way of asserting control over her environment, a physical manifestation of her reclaiming her own space. She began to spend more time outdoors, finding a peace in nature that she had been denied in the claustrophobic, secret-filled rooms of her previous life. She found that the sun, the wind, and the sound of the ocean were healing in ways that no therapy session could replicate. She was learning, for the first time, to listen to the cadence of her own heart rather than the demands of his. There were still nights when the memories would surface, unbidden and cold. The sound of a siren or the sight of a patrol car would send a phantom jolt of adrenaline through her system. But she was learning how to manage these triggers, how to breathe through the discomfort, and how to remind herself that she was safe. She was no longer the wife of a predator. She was a woman who had survived the most profound betrayal imaginable. She was reclaiming her right to be happy, her right to be at peace, and her right to define her own future. The trial had been the end of his story, but it was merely the prologue to her own. She began to look ahead to a future that felt, for the first time, like an open field rather than a narrow corridor. She thought about her education, her professional aspirations, and the way she could contribute to a world that was better, kinder, and more honest than the one she had lived in for those 18 years. She knew that the road would not always be smooth. She would have days where the grief would rise like a tide, but she was armed with the knowledge of her own strength. She had endured the fire, she had survived the collapse, and she had built a foundation that was, at last, entirely her own. As she looked out at the horizon, she didn't see the dark, shifting shadows of the past. She saw the bright, clear light of her own potential, and for the first time in a very long time, she was ready to walk into it. The silence of the night was no longer the silence of secrets. It was the silence of peace, a quiet, humming stillness that was hers to keep, hers to guard, and hers to enjoy. The nightmare had finally ended, and the morning was here. The aftermath of the trial was not a sudden clearing of the clouds, but a long, deliberate, and often agonizing journey through the debris of a life that had been systematically leveled. For Rachel Alvarez, the finality of the 205-year sentence did not immediately equate to peace. Instead, it ushered in the quiet, overwhelming work of mourning. She was not just mourning the death of a marriage or the betrayal of a partner. She was mourning the 18 years of her youth that had been fed into the maw of a monster. She had to reconcile the man she had loved, the father of her children, with the predator who had spent his nights hunting the vulnerable. It was a cognitive dissonance so profound that it took years to navigate, a process of peeling back the layers of her own memory to see where the truth ended and the performance began. Every cherished memory, the anniversaries, the holidays, the quiet moments of domestic intimacy, was now retroactively poisoned, viewed through the lens of a betrayal that had turned her entire existence into an unwitting accomplice to his crimes. The psychological reconstruction required a level of radical honesty that Rachel found both terrifying and liberating. She began to dissect her own role, not to accept blame, but to understand her own vulnerability. She acknowledged the deep-seated desire for belonging that had led her to overlook the red flags, the way she had prioritized the image of a happy family over the reality of a dysfunctional and eventually criminal union. She learned to forgive the younger version of herself, recognizing that she had been trapped in the same web of manipulation as the victims he had violated outside their home. This was a critical turning point. Realizing that she was not just a survivor of his violence, but a survivor of his psychological warfare. She had been conditioned to believe that her instincts were wrong, that her doubts were unfounded, and that her husband's authority was beyond question. Breaking that conditioning was the most exhausting, yet essential work of her life. Today, Rachel defines her existence not by what she lost, but by what she reclaimed. She has stepped out of the shadow of a name that once meant protection and came to signify terror, forging a new identity that is hers alone. She is no longer the wife, the victim, or the new girl searching for a place to belong. She is a survivor who has constructed her own foundation, one that does not require the support of anyone else. Her focus remains, as it always has, on her children, the 3 souls who survived the firestorm and whom she has raised with a fierce, protective, and grounding love. They are the living evidence of her resilience, the ones who anchor her to the present when the memories of the past threaten to pull her back into the dark. Watching them grow, she finds a joy that is untainted by the lies of the past, seeing in them a generation that knows how to speak truth to power, a lesson she has instilled in them through her own painful journey. When she reflects on the life she lived, Rachel does not indulge in the luxury of self-pity. She has discarded the shame he tried to burden her with, recognizing that his crimes were his own, not hers. She refuses to be a victim, choosing instead to carry the weight of her survival as a badge of honor. She speaks of her past with a detached clarity, a testament to how far she has traveled from the naive young woman who once thought a badge guaranteed a man's character. She knows now that integrity is not found in a title, a uniform, or a social status, but in the quiet, consistent actions of a person when they believe no one is looking, the very place where Sergio's humanity had long ago withered and died. She has learned that the true nature of a person is revealed not in the grand gestures of public service, but in the small, private choices made in the absence of accountability. There is a profound stillness in Rachel's life now, a deliberate, earned tranquility that she guards with the same ferocity she once used to protect her marriage. She has learned the hardest lesson of all, that trust is not a default setting, but a privilege to be earned, and that true safety is found in the autonomy of one's own heart. She no longer looks to a partner to complete her, or to provide the roots she missed in her childhood. She has become her own anchor, her own home, and her own shelter. This independence is not a rejection of love, but a refinement of it. A demand for a connection based on honesty rather than illusion. She has found that the silence she once feared, the silence of an empty house or an uncoupled life, is actually a canvas upon which she can paint her own future. The message she leaves for others is one of absolute vigilance and radical self-worth. She wants people to understand that when someone tries to define your reality for you, when they use their authority or their love to silence your instincts, that is not a relationship. It is a trap. She stands as a living, breathing refutation of the monster who tried to erase her. She is not the footnote in his dark biography. She is the author of her own future. She participates in support networks, sharing her story not as a cautionary tale, but as a roadmap for others who might be trapped in similar cycles of abuse and gaslighting. She talks openly about the grit, the fear, and the necessary, cold-blooded decisions required to save one's own life, emphasizing that survival is not a passive event but an active, ongoing commitment. As she watches her children move forward, thriving in a world that she has made safe for them with her own hands, she finds a joy that is untainted by the lies of the past. The firestorm is over, the house has been rebuilt, and for the first time the foundation is solid, honest, and entirely her own. She is finally, truly, and irrevocably free. The journey from the shadow of the badge to the clarity of her own autonomy has been the defining arc of her life. She has learned that the most profound form of justice is not just the sentence served by her former husband, but the happiness she has cultivated in his absence. Every day she lives with joy, every milestone her children reach, and every moment of peace she experiences is a quiet, persistent refusal to let him win. In the end, Rachel Alvarez has achieved the impossible. She has outlived the nightmare. She has transitioned from a woman who was a pawn in a predator's game to a woman who is the sovereign of her own reality. The legacy of her life is not the crime committed against her, but the character she forged in the aftermath. As she moves into her future, she does so with a sense of clarity that is sharp, luminous, and untouchable. She is a woman who has finally arrived, not at a destination, not at a status, and not at a relationship, but at herself. And for Rachel, after everything she has endured, that is the most beautiful place she has ever been. The fire is out, the smoke has cleared, and standing amidst the foundation she built with her own 2 hands, she finally knows the truth. She was always strong enough to walk away, she was always worthy of the truth, and she was always fundamentally the architect of her own salvation. This is not just an end. It is a permanent beginning. The story of Rachel Alvarez does not conclude with the finality of the gavel or the heavy, iron-clanging shut of the prison doors. In the narratives of true crime, the audience is often offered the voyeuristic satisfaction of seeing the villain punished, a tidy ending that allows the public to exhale and move on. Yet, this traditional framing ignores the most grueling, quiet, and profound phase of a survivor's journey, the long, silent winter of the soul that follows the storm. For Rachel, the aftermath was not a destination. It became the very air she breathed, a new and necessary way of existing in a world that had been fundamentally remapped. The realization that she had been an unsuspecting passenger in a monster's vehicle for 18 years required a total, painful recalibration of her entire reality. She had to learn how to exist without the filter of her husband's manipulation, how to trust her own perceptions after 2 decades of being told that her instincts were the enemy, and how to define herself not through the lens of a marriage, but through the singular, unyielding power of her own endurance. In the years since the trial, Rachel has dedicated her life to the quiet, revolutionary act of healing. This process has not been linear, nor has it been tidy. It has involved countless hours of introspection, confronting the ghost of the woman she used to be, that young adoptive-seeking soul who so desperately wanted to belong that she ignored the flashing red lights of a predator. She has come to view that younger version of herself with a profound sense of compassion rather than the sharp judgment she once felt. She understands now that her desire for family was a beautiful, human trait, and that it was precisely that beauty which made her such an effective target for a man who specialized in the exploitation of human longing. She has learned that her empathy was not a weakness, but a gift, a precious finite resource that she must now reserve only for those who are worthy of it. Her children, now growing into their own lives, serve as the living, vibrant testament to her success as a protector. She shielded them from the absolute worst of the chaos, absorbing the brunt of the instability so that they could continue to see the world as a place where kindness, however rare, is possible. She does not hide her history from them, but she refuses to let it define their inheritance. She teaches them that power is not found in a badge, a title, or an intimidating presence, but in the courage to speak the truth when it is dangerous to do so. They see in her not a victim, but a titan. A woman who walked through a fire that would have consumed most people and emerged with the clarity to build a home from the ashes. The public narrative surrounding the case has slowly faded, as it always does in the ephemeral world of media, but the personal narrative for Rachel remains a living, evolving work. She has become a voice for others who find themselves caught in the web of an authority-wielding predator. She understands the specific, terrifying paralysis that comes with realizing your partner is a criminal, particularly when that partner is a member of law enforcement, someone society has trained you to trust above all others. She knows the isolation of feeling like the system is working against you, and she uses that knowledge to foster a sense of radical self-reliance in those she encounters. She has moved from being a woman who sought to be completed by another to a woman who is entirely, unapologetically whole on her own terms. As she moves forward, the silence that she once feared has become her greatest comfort. It is no longer the silence of secrets and hidden crimes. It is the silence of peace, the quiet, steady hum of a house where the doors are locked not because she is afraid of who is coming in, but because she is satisfied with who is already inside. She has reclaimed her name, her story, and her future. The monster is buried behind concrete walls, and the life he tried to steal has been repurposed into something far more resilient. Rachel Alvarez stands today not as a monument to what happened to her, but as a testament to what she was able to survive. She has walked out of the darkness and into a clarity that is unyielding, permanent, and entirely her own. She has realized that the greatest victory was never the conviction, The greatest victory is the life she leads every day. It is found in the simple, mundane choices, the books she reads, the friends she chooses, the boundaries she sets. She no longer seeks validation from external sources. The void she once felt, that hungry space where she felt she needed someone else to anchor her, has been filled with the understanding of her own worth. She is the architect of her own peace. She understands that while a predator may steal your time, your trust, and your home, they can never, ever own the spirit of a survivor who refuses to go down. This new life is built on the ruins of the old, but it is not a replica. She has discarded the architecture of her previous existence, choosing instead to build something open, light-filled, and transparent. She invites others to see the strength she has cultivated, not to showcase her pain, but to demonstrate the possibility of reconstruction. Her life is a living answer to the question of whether a person can truly start over. She has proven that it is possible to lose everything you thought you were, and find everything you were always meant to be. As she watches the sun set on another day, Rachel feels a sense of quiet triumph. She is a woman who has finally arrived, not at a destination, not at a status, and not at a relationship, but at herself. And for Rachel, after everything she has endured, that is the most beautiful place she has ever been. The fire is out, the smoke has cleared, and standing amidst the foundation she built with her own 2 hands, she finally knows the truth. She was always strong enough to walk away, she was always worthy of the truth, and she was always fundamentally the architect of her own salvation. Her journey is a roadmap for any woman who has ever felt trapped, a signal in the dark that says, I made it out, and you can too. The legacy of her struggle is not the trauma, but the triumph. She has turned her scars into a map for others. She has proven that while the darkness can be all-encompassing, it is never permanent. The human spirit, when given the space to breathe and the truth to stand upon, will always rise. And so Rachel moves into her future with a steady gaze, a calm heart, and the profound, unshakable knowledge that she is finally, fully, and irreversibly her own woman. The monster is a ghost of the past, but she is the master of her present, and she is building a legacy that will outlive the pain. A legacy of truth, of courage, and of the enduring power of a woman who chose to live. The final horizon of Rachel's journey is not defined by the absence of the past, but by the mastery of her present. If the years of the investigation and trial were the crucible, then the time that has followed is the forging of the metal. She no longer looks at the world with the wide, trusting eyes of the girl who sought belonging in the aisles of a grocery store. She views it with the seasoned gaze of a woman who has peered into the depths of human darkness and refused to be consumed by it. There is a quiet, steady power in her movements now, a lack of performative urgency that defined her life as a wife. She understands that she does not need to prove her goodness to anyone, nor does she need to seek validation from a partner to justify her place in the world. She is, by all measures, her own anchor. In the small, private moments, the morning coffee, the quiet drive to school, the evening conversations with her children, she finds the sanctity she had been searching for all along. These are not grand, televised victories. They are the quiet, revolutionary triumphs of a survivor. She has built a home that is an exact inversion of the one she lived in with Sergio. Where there was once the suffocating atmosphere of secrets and baiting arguments, there is now an environment of radical transparency. She encourages her children to speak their truths, to trust their instincts, and to recognize that their value is inherent, not something to be earned through compliance or performance. She has turned the site of her greatest trauma into a masterclass on how to cultivate safety. Looking back at the trajectory of her life, Rachel sees the patterns clearly now, and she does not shy away from them. She acknowledges the pain of the deception, the humiliation of the public exposure, and the sheer terror of the escape, but she does not let those threads become the rope that hangs her future. She has moved beyond the narrative of happening to. She has taken the scattered pages of her life and written a new final chapter, one that belongs entirely to her. She has learned that the most profound form of justice is not just the sentence served by her former husband, but the happiness she has cultivated in his absence. Every day she lives with joy, every milestone her children reach, and every moment of peace she experiences is a quiet, persistent refusal to let him win. She remains a beacon for others who feel trapped in the shadows of someone else's power. Her story, once a shameful secret she hid behind a mask of domestic normalcy, has become a tool of empowerment. She does not sugarcoat the reality of her struggle, nor does she offer platitudes about moving on. She talks about the grit, the fear, and the necessary cold-blooded decisions required to save one's own life. She has become an advocate for the idea that survival is an active, ongoing commitment. She reminds those who are still listening that the loudest threats are often the ones whispered in the dark, and the most dangerous people are those who present themselves as your greatest protectors. In the end, Rachel Alvarez has achieved the impossible. She has outlived the nightmare. She has transitioned from a woman who was a pawn in a predator's game to a woman who is the sovereign of her own reality. The legacy of her life is not the crime committed against her, but the character she forged in the aftermath. As she moves into her future, she does so with a sense of clarity that is sharp, luminous, and untouchable. She is a woman who has finally arrived, not at a destination, not at a status, and not at a relationship, but at herself. And for Rachel, after everything she has endured, that is the most beautiful place she has ever been. The fire is out, the smoke has cleared, and standing amidst the foundation she built with her own 2 hands, she finally knows the truth. She was always strong enough to walk away. She was always worthy of the truth, and she was always fundamentally the architect of her own salvation. She reflects on the nature of courage, realizing that it was not the absence of fear that drove her, but the decision to act despite it. The moments she spent trembling in the laundry room, the nights she whispered into her pillow to keep from screaming, those were not moments of weakness. They were the labor pains of her independence. She had to undergo an ego death, a shedding of the identity that had been curated for her by a man who thrived on her diminished sense of self. She had to dismantle the internal architecture of the devoted wife and replace it with the steel frame of the autonomous woman. This autonomy has brought a new rhythm to her life. She works now with a sense of purpose that transcends the mundane. Her professional choices, her social circle, and her personal habits are all curated for health and authenticity. She has found that the best way to honor the women Sergio harmed is to live a life that stands in direct opposition to the one he tried to force upon them. By flourishing, by maintaining her sanity, and by raising children who know their own worth, she is casting a light that exposes the shadows of his crimes as small, cowardly, and ultimately ephemeral. The environment she has cultivated is one of absolute intellectual and emotional honesty. She no longer avoids the difficult conversations. If a friend, a neighbor, or a colleague suggests that she should be happier or less intense, she does not apologize. She acknowledges that her intensity is a byproduct of her survival, and she does not hide it. She is comfortable being the person in the room who sees the truth, who asks the hard questions, and who refuses to engage in the polite fictions that keep dysfunctional systems alive. This is not out of malice. It is out of a deep-seated respect for the reality that she was once denied. She has also found a peculiar peace with her own history. There is no longer a before and after that feels disconnected. She understands the continuity of her spirit. The girl who moved from foster home to foster home, the woman who married the officer, and the survivor who stands here today are all the same person. She has simply integrated the experiences, learned the lessons, and discarded the baggage. She is a cohesive individual. She has stopped trying to edit the past and has started to embrace the wisdom it provided, however brutal the tuition may have been. One of her most profound realizations is that she is no longer afraid of being alone. For most of her life, she viewed solitude as a synonym for loneliness, a state of being that needed to be filled by the presence of a man. Now she realizes that solitude is a state of being where she is finally in the company of the one person she never really knew, herself. She has become her own best friend, her own confidant, and her own greatest support system. The conversations she has with herself are now characterized by kindness and understanding, rather than the criticism and doubt that Sergio had weaponized against her. She often finds herself looking at her children as they sleep, struck by the miraculous, fragile beauty of their unburdened lives. They know a version of their mother that is stronger, more present, and more honest than the one who lived in the house in West Sacramento. They see her as she is, a woman who has faults, who has fears, but who is fundamentally, irrevocably committed to their well-being and her own. She has taught them that the world is a complex, sometimes dangerous place, but that they have the internal capacity to navigate it with grace and resilience. She is the lighthouse that they can always return to, Not because she is perfect, but because she is real. As she gazes out at the world from the quiet comfort of her current life, Rachel understands that her salvation was not a gift bestowed upon her. It was a structure she built, beam by beam, in the dead of the night. It was an act of creation, a defiant assertion of her own humanity against the dehumanizing forces of a predator. She has created a sanctuary that is not built on the shifting sands of someone else's promises, but on the granite of her own character. She is the architect, the builder, and the resident of her own destiny, and she knows that she will never, ever be moved again. The fire that once threatened to incinerate her has become the light that guides her path. The lessons she learned have become the values she lives by. The person she was has become the person she is, a testament to the fact that the human soul is not easily extinguished, that the truth will always have the final say, and that a life reclaimed from the jaws of a predator is a life that is, in every way, infinitely more precious than it ever was before. She is finally, fully, and irreversibly her own woman, and that, she knows, is the ultimate triumph. Every breath she takes, every laugh she shares, every achievement she celebrates is a defiance of the past, and a dedication to the beautiful, expansive future she has carved out for herself. She was always strong enough to walk away, and today she is finally free to walk toward a life that is hers, entirely and forever. The final chapter of Rachel's story is not marked by the conclusion of a trial or the simple passage of time, but by the quiet, permanent establishment of her own sovereign autonomy. She has reached a stage in her life where the past is no longer a haunting specter, but a resolved historical record, a testament to a version of herself that existed in a state of unknowing. The woman who once feared the silence of an empty house has learned to cherish the peace of a home where no secrets linger behind the doors. She has moved from a life characterized by external dependencies to one defined by an unshakable internal integrity. Her journey, while paved with the jagged, painful debris of betrayal, has ultimately led her to a destination of profound self-possession. There is a distinct, rhythmic beauty to her current existence that contrasts sharply with the frantic, performative nature of her former marriage. She operates now with an intentionality she never possessed before. Every decision is her own, every goal is aligned with the well-being of her children, and every relationship she nurtures is built upon the solid, honest ground of mutual respect. She has fundamentally rewired her understanding of what it means to be protected. She no longer looks for a badge or a uniform to provide a sense of security. She has discovered that the most reliable form of protection is the clarity of her own judgment and the strength of her own voice. She has taken the power that Sergio once tried to strip from her and reclaimed it, transforming it into a shield that she manages with grace, vigilance, and above all, self-compassion. Her relationship with her children has become the true North Star of her life. They represent the victory she fought for when the odds were insurmountable. As she watches them navigate their own lives, she sees the reflection of her resilience, not just in their ability to cope with the truth of their history, but in their blossoming capacity for empathy, kindness, and independent thought. She has ensured that the cycle of trauma, which once threatened to devour them, was stopped in its tracks by her refusal to be broken. She has taught them that their history is a part of who they are, but it is not the totality of their identity. This is perhaps her greatest contribution to the world, the cultivation of 3 young people who are unburdened by the darkness of their origin and who understand that their worth is inherent, not something to be granted by an authority figure. In the quiet, reflective moments that define her later years, Rachel often thinks about the nature of truth itself. She has learned that the truth is not always comfortable, and it is rarely convenient, but it is the only foundation upon which a durable life can be built. She no longer harbors the desire to be liked, or to be seen as the perfect woman in the eyes of a community that was all too happy to judge her. She has traded the vanity of public perception for the internal satisfaction of a life lived without artifice. She is comfortable being misunderstood, she is comfortable being alone, and she is comfortable in the knowledge that she has absolutely nothing left to hide. The vulnerability that once made her a target for a predator has been tempered into a wisdom that protects her heart without walling it off from the world. As she looks toward the future, Rachel carries no regrets, only a profound sense of gratitude for her own survival. She knows that she is a rare kind of survivor, one who didn't just escape, but one who fully integrated the lessons of her survival into the architecture of her character. She is a woman who has walked through the fire, felt the heat, and come out the other side not with scars that limit her, but with a deep understanding of her own fire-forged worth. The story of Rachel Alvarez is no longer a story about a man who wore a badge and used it to commit atrocities. It is a story about a woman who wore the weight of a nightmare and eventually dropped it to step into the sun. She stands now as a living testament to the fact that the spirit is not easily extinguished, that the truth will always have the final say, and that a life reclaimed from the jaws of a predator is a life that is, in every way, infinitely more precious than it ever was before. She is finally, fully, and irreversibly her own woman, and that, she knows, is the ultimate triumph. She has learned that her life is not defined by the man who tried to destroy it, but by the woman who refused to let that destruction be the final word. Every morning when she wakes up to the quiet, unfiltered light of a house that is entirely hers, she feels a sense of peace that is profound and rhythmic. She no longer checks the driveway for patrol cars. She no longer calculates her movements based on someone else's schedule. She has the luxury of presence. She exists in the now, a space she once had to flee from in order to maintain her sanity. She is deeply invested in the small pleasures of life, the texture of a well-worn book, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the laughter of her children filling the rooms. These are not trivial things. They are the reclaimed components of a life she was told she could not have. She has also found a new way to contribute to the world. By sharing her journey with those who are still in the thick of their own crises, she has transformed her pain into a map for others. She does not offer easy answers, nor does she claim that the path to healing is simple. She offers what she has, the truth. She tells them about the fear, the doubt, the moments of near collapse, and the sheer, exhausting effort required to stand up again. In doing so, she provides a different kind of authority, one based on lived experience rather than institutional power. She has become the authority she once sought, and in the process, she has helped many others find their way back to themselves. The legacy she is building is one of radical autonomy and enduring kindness. She has moved beyond the need for external validation, finding that the only approval that truly matters is her own. She has learned that being good is not the same as being compliant, and that true goodness often requires the courage to be difficult, to say no, and to stand alone. She has embraced her complexity, her history, and her potential. She is not a finished product. She is a work in progress, a person who is constantly learning, growing, and expanding the boundaries of her own world. In the end, Rachel's life is a masterclass in the power of the human spirit to transcend its circumstances. She has taken the most difficult materials, betrayal, fear, loss, and chaos, and has used them to construct a life that is elegant, sturdy, and profoundly beautiful. She has proven that it is possible to lose everything you thought you were, and find everything you were always meant to be. As she stands in the center of her life, she feels a sense of quiet, unshakable triumph. She is the architect, the builder, and the resident of her own destiny. She is the woman who survived the nightmare and, in the process, discovered that the only person she ever truly needed to be was herself. The story ends here, not because the struggle has ceased to exist. Life is always a series of challenges, but because the power dynamic has shifted. The external threat is gone, and the internal threat of self-doubt has been dismantled. She is the master of her own narrative, the voice that tells the story, and the hand that writes the next page. She is Rachel Alvarez, and she is free. Every breath she takes is an assertion of that freedom. Every day she lives is a celebration of that truth. And every choice she makes is a testament to the fact that she has not only survived, but she has thrived. This is her victory, and it is a victory that is silent, steady, and entirely beautifully her own. The culmination of Rachel's journey is not defined by a dramatic final act, but by the profound, quiet majesty of a life reclaimed and settled into its own rhythm. As the years have transitioned from a state of emergency to a state of equilibrium, she has developed an almost reverent relationship with time. For a decade and a half, time was an enemy, a countdown to the next lie, a clock that measured her husband's movements, a calendar marked by the anxious waiting for his return. Now, time is a resource she commands with authority. She understands that the 18 years lost to deception were not merely stolen. They were a tuition paid to the school of absolute, unvarnished reality. She has integrated that experience, not as a weight to carry, but as a lens through which she evaluates every new experience, relationship, and opportunity that enters her orbit. Her house, once a site of strategic survival, has transformed into a living monument of her aesthetic and emotional values. There is a specific, intentional curation to her surroundings, a warmth that radiates from the choices she has made to reflect her own identity, rather than to maintain an image of domestic perfection. She has replaced the furniture that once bore witness to his presence with pieces that speak to her own tastes and comforts. She has filled the walls with art that evokes serenity, rather than the stiff, staged professional portraits that once adorned them. She has created an environment where her children can grow without the pressure of maintaining a facade, where laughter is genuine, and where conflict is handled not with manipulation or fear, but with the radical, transparent honesty of a family that has seen the alternative and rejected it entirely. The legacy Rachel is carving out for her children is one of intellectual and emotional liberation. She sees them navigating the world with a sense of self-assurance that she only acquired in the wake of disaster. She has instilled in them the understanding that power is never inherent to a position or a title. It is earned through character and validated by actions. They are growing into individuals who prioritize their own moral compass over social expectations, and who possess the discernment to see through the charismatic masks that so easily fooled their mother. She watches them with a quiet, fierce pride, knowing that she has not only saved their childhoods, but has provided them with the foundation to live lives of authenticity. This, more than any judicial victory or public acknowledgement, is the true fruit of her survival. She has also found a mature, nuanced peace with the concept of justice. She recognizes that the prison sentence handed down to her former husband was a necessary legal instrument, but she also knows that justice is an internal state, a reclaiming of one's own sovereignty. She does not look to the state to heal her. She has taken that responsibility into her own hands. She has found that the most potent justice is the fact of her own thriving. The way she wakes up, the way she works, the way she loves, and the way she sleeps, all without the shadow of his influence. Every day she lives in accordance with her own values is a day she wins. A day she reclaims the territory of her own life from the void he tried to create. As a woman who was once isolated by secrets, she now values the power of community, albeit a community built on the bedrock of shared truth, rather than superficial obligation. She engages with others who have navigated the treacherous waters of narcissistic abuse and gaslighting, finding a common language of resilience that transcends the specifics of their stories. She has learned that the most healing thing a person can do is to testify to their own life, to speak the truth of what happened, not to solicit pity, but to validate the reality of their own experience. She has become an expert at holding space for others, using the patience and the clarity she forged in the furnace of her own trauma to guide them toward their own versions of salvation. There is a sense of completion in her interactions with the world now. She no longer feels the need to shrink or to apologize for her existence. She occupies space with a deliberate, quiet confidence. When she encounters the challenges of life, the mundane frustrations, the professional obstacles, the personal losses, she approaches them with a pragmatic, grounded perspective. She has tested her limits and found that she is made of stronger material than she ever imagined. She knows that she is capable of handling the unexpected, that she is resilient in the face of chaos, and that she can endure the silence of her own life without needing to fill it with distraction or artifice. She reflects often on the concept of home, recognizing that it was never a physical place, but an internal state of being. The houses she lived in before, the structures she meticulously cleaned and decorated, were merely attempts to manifest an internal sense of safety that she did not yet possess. Now she carries that safety within her. She is home wherever she stands because she is in alignment with her own truth. This transition from seeking external safety to cultivating internal security has been the most significant transformation of her life. She is no longer dependent on the architecture of a relationship or the structure of a community to feel secure. She is secure in her own skin, in her own history, and in her own capacity to navigate whatever the future may hold. She also finds beauty in the complexity of her own growth. She does not try to simplify her history or gloss over the fact that she was once a person who allowed herself to be manipulated. She holds her past and her present in a balanced perspective, acknowledging that she was a product of her environment, her upbringing, and her own desperate needs, while simultaneously taking full ownership of the woman she has become. She has achieved a form of wholeness that is not about being fixed or healed, in the sense of erasing the past, but in the sense of integrating all of her experiences into a life that is deep, layered, and profoundly rich. She is a survivor in the truest sense of the word. Someone who has taken the wreckage of her own life and repurposed it into a foundation for a future that is entirely, vibrantly alive. As she looks toward the future, the horizon is not an imposing barrier, but a beckoning invitation. She has lived through the worst that life could throw at her and discovered that the horizon always expands. She is excited about the chapters yet to be written, the books she will read, the places she will see, and the connections she will form as her children continue to forge their own paths. She has the patience of a woman who has already endured the weight, the perspective of a woman who has seen the collapse of a world, and the joy of a woman who has claimed the right to be happy. In the end, Rachel's life is a masterpiece of self-creation. She has moved through the darkness, held on to her truth, and emerged with the ability to define her own reality. She has shown that even when you are the victim of a calculated, systemic, and deeply personal betrayal, you have the power to define the final act. She is the author of her life, the protagonist of her story, and the guardian of her own freedom. Every morning she chooses herself, not because she is forced to, but because she has learned through the most difficult trial imaginable, that the only person you are ever guaranteed to have in this life is the person you look at in the mirror. And for Rachel Alvarez, that person is not just a survivor, not just a mother, and not just a woman. She is a triumph of the human spirit, a beacon of clarity in a complex world, and the architect of a life that is in every single breath a resonant, defiant, and beautiful yes to her own existence. The final chapter of Rachel Alvarez's journey is not a conclusion but a profound settling, an arrival at a state of being where the past is no longer a haunting weight, but a solid foundation upon which she has built a life of radical honesty. As the years have smoothed the sharp edges of her trauma, Rachel has reached a place of quiet, resolute grace. She no longer looks at the world with the wary eyes of a woman waiting for the next shoe to drop. Instead, she moves through her days with the steady, unhurried cadence of someone who knows exactly who she is and what she is capable of. The house, which once served as a silent witness to the most complex performance of her life, is now a sanctuary of authentic existence, where the silence is not a mask for secrets, but a space for peace. In these later years, Rachel has found a mature, nuanced peace with the concept of legacy. She understands that the 18 years she spent tethered to a predator were not merely lost time. They were the grueling, expensive tuition paid to the school of absolute, unvarnished reality. She does not look back at that woman, the one who moved from foster home to foster home, the one who so desperately wanted to belong that she built her life on a foundation of shifting sand, with pity. She views her with a profound, almost tender compassion. She knows now that her desperation for a home was a beautiful human trait, and that it was precisely her capacity for love and loyalty that made her such a target for a man who specialized in the exploitation of human longing. She has forgiven her younger self for not knowing the things she could not possibly have known, and in doing so she has fully integrated her history into a life that is deep, layered, and profoundly rich. Her relationship with her children remains the most significant and rewarding endeavor of her life. They have grown into young adults who navigate the complexities of the world with a sense of discernment and self-worth that she only acquired in the wake of disaster. She watches them and sees the reflection of her resilience, not just in their ability to handle the truth of their history, but in their blossoming capacity for empathy, kindness, and independent thought. She has ensured that the cycle of trauma, which once threatened to swallow them, was broken by her own refusal to be consumed. They represent the living, breathing victory she fought for when the odds were insurmountable. She has taught them that power is not found in a badge or a position of authority, but in the courage to speak one's truth, even when it is dangerous. This, more than any judicial verdict or public vindication, is the true fruit of her survival. Rachel has also found a new way to contribute to the world, stepping into the role of a quiet advocate. By sharing the lessons of her survival, not as a cautionary tale, but as a map for others, she has transformed her pain into a tool for empowerment. She does not sugarcoat the reality of her struggle, nor does she offer empty platitudes about moving on. She talks about the grit, the fear, and the necessary cold-blooded decisions required to save one's own life. She understands that for many, the realization that their partner is a predator is a paralyzing, isolating experience, especially when that partner is a member of law enforcement. By speaking her truth, she helps others navigate that paralyzing isolation, offering the one thing she lacked when she was in the thick of it: a mirror. There is a distinct, rhythmic beauty to her current existence that contrasts sharply with the frantic, performative nature of her former life. She operates with an intentionality she never possessed before. Every decision is her own, every goal is aligned with her authentic self, and every relationship she nurtures is built upon the solid, honest ground of mutual respect. She has fundamentally rewired her understanding of what it means to be safe. She no longer looks to external structures, be they marriage, institutional authority, or social status, to provide her with a sense of security. She has discovered that the most reliable form of safety is the clarity of her own judgment and the strength of her own voice. She has taken the power that was once stripped from her and reclaimed it, transforming it into a shield that she manages with grace, vigilance, and above all self-compassion. She often reflects on the nature of truth itself. She has learned that the truth is rarely comfortable, and it is never convenient, but it is the only foundation upon which a durable life can be built. She no longer harbors the desire to be perceived as the perfect woman in the eyes of a community that was all too happy to judge her. She has traded the vanity of public perception for the internal satisfaction of a life lived without artifice. She is comfortable being misunderstood, she is comfortable being alone, and she is comfortable in the knowledge that she has absolutely nothing left to hide. The vulnerability that once made her a target for a predator has been tempered into a wisdom that protects her heart without walling it off from the world. As she moves toward the future, Rachel carries no regrets, only a profound sense of gratitude for her own survival. She knows that she is a rare kind of survivor, one who didn't just escape, but one who fully integrated the lessons of her survival into the architecture of her character. She is a woman who has walked through the fire, felt the heat, and come out the other side not with scars that limit her, but with a deep understanding of her own fire-forged worth. The story of Rachel Alvarez is no longer a story about the man who wore a badge and used it to commit atrocities. It is a story about the woman who wore the weight of a nightmare and eventually dropped it to step into the sun. She stands now as a living testament to the fact that the spirit is not easily extinguished, that the truth will always have the final say, and that a life reclaimed from the jaws of a predator is a life that is, in every way, infinitely more precious than it ever was before. She is finally, fully, and irreversibly her own woman. She has learned that her life is not defined by the man who tried to destroy it, but by the woman who refused to let that destruction be the final word. Every morning when she wakes up to the quiet, unfiltered light of a house that is entirely hers, she feels a sense of peace that is profound and rhythmic. She no longer checks the driveway for patrol cars. She no longer calculates her movements based on someone else's schedule. She has the luxury of presence. She exists in the now, a space she once had to flee from in order to maintain her sanity. She is deeply invested in the small pleasures of life, the texture of a well-worn book, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the laughter of her children filling the rooms. These are not trivial things. They are the reclaimed components of a life she was once told she could not have. The legacy she is building is one of radical autonomy and enduring kindness. She has moved beyond the need for external validation, finding that the only approval that truly matters is her own. She has learned that being good is not the same as being compliant, and that true goodness often requires the courage to be difficult, to say no, and to stand alone. She has embraced her complexity, her history, and her potential. She is not a finished product. She is a work in progress, a person who is constantly learning, growing, and expanding the boundaries of her own world. In the end, Rachel's life is a masterpiece of self-creation. She has moved through the darkness, held onto her truth, and emerged with the ability to define her own reality. She has shown that even when you are the victim of a calculated, systemic, and deeply personal betrayal, you have the power to define the final act. She is the author of her life, the protagonist of her story, and the guardian of her own freedom. Every morning she chooses herself, not because she is forced to, but because she has learned through the most difficult trial imaginable, that the only person you are ever guaranteed to have in this life is the person you look at in the mirror. And for Rachel Alvarez, that person is not just a survivor, not just a mother, and not just a woman. She is a triumph of the human spirit, a beacon of clarity in a complex world, and the architect of a life that is in every single breath a resonant, defiant, and beautiful yes to her own existence. This is not the end of her growth, nor is it the end of her challenges. Life will continue to present her with the unpredictable, the difficult, and the uncertain. But she meets these challenges with the confidence of a woman who has already stared down the greatest threat of her life and found that she was stronger. The nightmare is a ghost of the past, but she is the master of her present, and she is building a legacy that will outlive the pain. A legacy of truth, of courage, and of the enduring power of a woman who chose to live. Every choice she makes is a testament to the fact that she has not only survived, but she has thrived. This is her victory, and it is a victory that is silent, steady, and entirely beautifully her own. The final chapter of Rachel Alvarez's journey, reaching into the stillness of 2026, is not a dramatic resolution but a profound, quiet alignment of her spirit with the life she has carved out of the wreckage. More than a decade has passed since the trial that dismantled the myth of the hero officer, and in that time, Rachel has moved from the frantic, survival-oriented phase of her recovery into a state of graceful, intentional living. She no longer looks at the past as a wound that must be constantly tended. It has become a scar, a mark of where she was broken and how she was put back together, stronger and more resilient than before. The woman who once moved through the world as an extension of her husband's shadow is now a luminous, singular presence, radiating a calm, earned authority that is entirely her own. Her home, located in a quiet corner of the country far from the ghosts of West Sacramento, is a sanctuary of radical honesty. There are no secrets here. The air is light, filled with the presence of her children, who are now young adults charting their own paths. Rachel watches them with a pride that is deep and unshakable, knowing that the most important task of her life, protecting their innocence while preparing them for the reality of the world, has been accomplished. She has successfully navigated the treacherous waters of motherhood post-trauma, teaching her children that strength is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear govern one's choices. They see in her not just a mother, but a survivor who never let the darkness of their father's crimes dim her capacity for light. In these quiet, settled days, Rachel has found a mature, nuanced peace with the concept of legacy. She understands that the years she spent tethered to a predator were not merely lost time. They were the grueling, expensive tuition paid to the school of absolute, unvarnished reality. She does not look back at that younger version of herself, the woman who was so desperate to belong that she built her life on a foundation of shifting sand, with pity. She views her with a profound, almost tender compassion. She knows now that her desire for a home was a beautiful human trait, and that it was precisely her capacity for love and loyalty that made her such a target for a man who specialized in the exploitation of human longing. She has forgiven her younger self for not knowing the things she could not possibly have known, and in doing so she has fully integrated her history into a life that is deep, layered, and profoundly rich. Her professional life, too, has become an extension of her evolution. She works with organizations dedicated to supporting victims of domestic abuse and systemic gaslighting, providing a kind of mentorship that only someone who has walked the fire can offer. She does not offer easy answers, she offers the truth. She talks about the grit, the fear, and the necessary cold-blooded decisions required to save one's own life. She understands the specific, terrifying paralysis that comes with realizing your partner is a predator, especially when that partner is a member of law enforcement, someone society has trained you to trust above all others. By speaking her truth, she helps others navigate that paralyzing isolation, offering the one thing she lacked when she was in the thick of it: a mirror. There is a distinct, rhythmic beauty to her current existence that contrasts sharply with the frantic, performative nature of her former life. She operates with an intentionality she never possessed before. Every decision is her own, every goal is aligned with her authentic self, and every relationship she nurtures is built upon the solid, honest ground of mutual respect. She has fundamentally rewired her understanding of what it means to be safe. She no longer looks to external structures, be they marriage, institutional authority, or social status, to provide her with a sense of security. She has discovered that the most reliable form of safety is the clarity of her own judgment and the strength of her own voice. She has taken the power that was once stripped from her and reclaimed it, transforming it into a shield that she manages with grace, vigilance, and above all self-compassion. She often reflects on the nature of truth itself. She has learned that the truth is rarely comfortable, and it is never convenient, but it is the only foundation upon which a durable life can be built. She no longer harbors the desire to be perceived as the perfect woman in the eyes of a community that was all too happy to judge her. She has traded the vanity of public perception for the internal satisfaction of a life lived without artifice. She is comfortable being misunderstood, she is comfortable being alone, and she is comfortable in the knowledge that she has absolutely nothing left to hide. The vulnerability that once made her a target for a predator has been tempered into a wisdom that protects her heart without walling it off from the world. As she moves toward the future, Rachel carries no regrets, only a profound sense of gratitude for her own survival. She knows that she is a rare kind of survivor, one who didn't just escape, but one who fully integrated the lessons of her survival into the architecture of her character. She is a woman who has walked through the fire, felt the heat, and come out the other side not with scars that limit her, but with a deep understanding of her own fire-forged worth. The story of Rachel Alvarez is no longer a story about the man who wore a badge and used it to commit atrocities. It is a story about the woman who wore the weight of a nightmare and eventually dropped it to step into the sun. She stands now as a living testament to the fact that the spirit is not easily extinguished, that the truth will always have the final say, and that a life reclaimed from the jaws of a predator is a life that is, in every way, infinitely more precious than it ever was before. She is finally, fully, and irreversibly her own woman. She has learned that her life is not defined by the man who tried to destroy it, but by the woman who refused to let that destruction be the final word. Every morning when she wakes up to the quiet, unfiltered light of a house that is entirely hers, she feels a sense of peace that is profound and rhythmic. She no longer checks the driveway for patrol cars. She no longer calculates her movements based on someone else's schedule. She has the luxury of presence. She exists in the now, a space she once had to flee from in order to maintain her sanity. She is deeply invested in the small pleasures of life, the texture of a well-worn book, the warmth of the sun on her skin, the laughter of her children filling the rooms. These are not trivial things. They are the reclaimed components of a life she was once told she could not have. The legacy she is building is one of radical autonomy and enduring kindness. She has moved beyond the need for external validation, finding that the only approval that truly matters is her own. She has learned that being good is not the same as being compliant, and that true goodness often requires the courage to be difficult, to say no, and to stand alone. She has embraced her complexity, her history, and her potential. She is not a finished product. She is a work in progress, a person who is constantly learning, growing, and expanding the boundaries of her own world. In the end, Rachel's life is a masterpiece of self-creation. She has moved through the darkness, held onto her truth, and emerged with the ability to define her own reality. She has shown that even when you are the victim of a calculated, systemic, and deeply personal betrayal, you have the power to define the final act. She is the author of her life, the protagonist of her story, and the guardian of her own freedom. Every morning she chooses herself, not because she is forced to, but because she has learned through the most difficult trial imaginable, that the only person you are ever guaranteed to have in this life is the person you look at in the mirror. And for Rachel Alvarez, that person is not just a survivor, not just a mother, and not just a woman. She is a triumph of the human spirit, a beacon of clarity in a complex world, and the architect of a life that is in every single breath a resonant, defiant, and beautiful yes to her own existence. The nightmare is a ghost of the past, but she is the master of her present, and she is building a legacy that will outlive the pain. A legacy of truth, of courage, and of the enduring power of a woman who chose to live. Every choice she makes is a testament to the fact that she has not only survived, but she has thrived. This is her victory, and it is a victory that is silent, steady, and entirely beautifully her own. Standing on this final horizon, Rachel knows that she has reached the place she was always meant to occupy. A life entirely, irrevocably, and beautifully hers. The narrative of Rachel Alvarez reaches its true, resonant conclusion not in the courtroom of a decade past, but in the quiet, expansive reality of a Saturday morning in July 2026. As the sunlight filters through the windows of her home in Florida, it illuminates a life that has been built with the deliberate, slow-motion care of someone who understands the weight of every beam and brick. This is not merely an existence, it is a declaration. Rachel stands in the center of her kitchen, the air cool and calm, realizing that for the first time in her life, the stillness is not a vacuum waiting to be filled by someone else's needs or threats. It is simply peace. The transition from the survivor who fled in the dead of winter to the woman who now flourishes in the midsummer heat is complete, a testament to a soul that refused to remain in the shadows of someone else's depravity. Looking back at the path that led here, Rachel views her life as a series of concentric circles, each one expanding as she shed the layers of falsehoods she had lived under. The innermost circle was the trap of her marriage, a dense, dark core of gaslighting, manipulation, and the slow, systemic erosion of her own intuition. For 18 years, she had been a captive to a narrative that was not her own, a performer in a play written by a man who thrived on her silence. She remembers the way she once held her breath in her own living room, the way she calibrated her voice, her clothes, and even her thoughts to avoid triggering the volatile anger that sat just beneath the surface of Sergio's heroic persona. That woman, the one who existed before 2013, feels like a distant ethereal figure, a tragedy she observes with detachment and profound kindness. The next circle was the explosion, the year of the investigation, the betrayal, and the agonizing, cold-blooded decision to leave. It was a time of pure, frantic adrenaline, a period where she had to operate with a split personality, the doting wife on the surface, and the survival strategist underneath. She remembers the weight of the tablets, the frantic packing of documents, the secret bank accounts, and the terror of every siren she heard in the distance. She realizes now that those months were the most dangerous of her life. A high-stakes chess match where the board was her own household. She had to become the very thing Sergio had underestimated. A woman who could see through his masks and navigate the world with a clarity he thought he had successfully dismantled. That period was the crucible. It was where the Rachel the world knew was dissolved, and the Rachel who would become the architect of her own salvation began to take form. Now, in 2026, she exists in the outermost circle, a place of expansive sovereign autonomy. The house she lives in is a reflection of this freedom. There are no locked drawers for secrets, no shadowed corners where she keeps the evidence of her survival. Everything is open, airy, and honest. She has cultivated a lifestyle that honors the complexity of her history without being defined by it. She works as a consultant for victims of abuse, using the cold, hard logic of her own experience to help others navigate the impossible choices she once faced. She speaks with a voice that is steady and resonant, a voice that no longer trembles when it describes the realities of predatory behavior. She has become the authority she once sought, turning her tragedy into a beacon that helps others see the way out of their own dark corridors. Her children, now entering the prime of their own adulthood, are the most tangible proof of her victory. They are independent, clear-eyed, and profoundly empathetic individuals who have never known the suffocating performative atmosphere of that house in West Sacramento. Rachel sees the way they stand up for themselves, the way they question authority, and the way they move through the world with an unshakable sense of self-worth. She knows that she broke the cycle. She took the poison that was meant to be their inheritance and neutralized it with the antidote of truth. Every accomplishment they achieve, every challenge they overcome, and every laugh they share in her presence is a testament to the fact that she did not just save them. She gave them the tools to save themselves. The peace she has cultivated is a radical, earned independence. She has learned that loneliness is not a state of being she should fear, but a state of being where she is finally in the company of the one person who has been there through it all, herself. She has become her own best friend, her own confidant, and her own greatest support system. The internal dialogue that once echoed with his criticisms now hums with her own self-affirmations. She has learned that being alone is not a deficit, but a luxury, a space to think, to grow, and to simply exist without the intrusion of someone else's reality. She has found that the best partner she ever could have asked for is the one she found within herself. As she moves through her day, she feels a profound sense of gratitude for the resilience of the human spirit. She understands now that the trauma she endured was not a death sentence, but a shedding. It was the brutal, necessary act of burning down a life that was never meant to hold her, so that she could build a life that was designed for her spirit to expand. She has discovered that she is not a fragile thing to be protected, but a force of nature that can withstand the storm and still rise to greet the sun. She has reclaimed her name, her story, and her right to define her own existence. The legacy she leaves behind will not be measured by the crimes committed against her, but by the integrity of the life she led after the smoke cleared. She has chosen to live with a fierce, unwavering commitment to the truth. She does not look away from the hard things, she does not soften the edges of the difficult lessons, and she does not pretend that everything was meant to be. She acknowledges the cruelty of her fate, she accepts the weight of her survival, and she celebrates the triumph of her autonomy. She is a woman who has finally arrived, not at a destination, not at a status, and not at a relationship, but at herself. Standing in the sunlight of this July morning, Rachel Alvarez reflects on the arc of her life and finds it complete. The nightmare of the badge, the coldness of the investigation, the long, slow climb out of the abyss, they all coalesce into the wisdom that defines her now. She knows that she was always strong enough to walk away, she was always worthy of the truth, and she was always fundamentally the architect of her own salvation. Her story is a testament to the fact that while darkness may be an inevitable part of the landscape, it is never the destination. As she walks out into the world today, she does so with a sense of clarity that is sharp, luminous, and untouchable. She is Rachel and she is whole. The history of her marriage is a footnote in a life that is, in every single breath, a resonant, defiant, and beautiful yes to her own existence. She has lived through the fire, she has survived the collapse, and she has built a foundation that is, at last, entirely her own. There is no more searching, no more pretending, and no more fear of the future. There is only the living, breathing, and profound reality of her own freedom. She has finally, fully, and irreversibly arrived at the person she was always meant to be. And for Rachel, after everything she has endured, that is the most beautiful, hard-won, and perfect place she has ever been. This is her victory, and it is a victory that is silent, steady, and entirely beautifully her own. The final indelible chapter of Rachel Alvarez's life, written in the quiet, steady ink of 2026, is not a story of what was done to her, but a testament to the life she reclaimed. Sitting on her veranda as the morning sun casts long golden shadows across the landscape of her home in Florida, she is struck not by the magnitude of her survival, but by the simplicity of her peace. The trauma, once a monolithic, all-encompassing shadow, has receded into the background of her consciousness. It is a historical fact, an artifact of a different life, no longer holding the power to define the temperature of her room, the tone of her voice, or the direction of her future. She has reached the summit of her own mountain, and from this vantage point, the terrain of her past looks distant, blurred by the heat of her own present-day existence. This piece is not a gift. It is a monument she built with her own hands. Every stone of this life, the daily routines, the boundary setting, the career as a consultant for survivors, was laid with the deliberate intent of creating a reality that could never again be compromised. Rachel has internalized the profound, agonizing lesson that the most dangerous environments are often the ones where we feel most protected. She remembers the 18 years she spent in the house in West Sacramento, meticulously maintaining a facade of domestic order, never realizing that she was the primary decoration in a museum of lies. Now there is no facade. Her home is an honest space, a place where the air is clear, the walls are transparent, and the intentions are visible. She has traded the performative safety of a hero's wife for the messy, authentic, and utterly secure safety of a woman who knows exactly who she is. Her children, now young adults navigating the threshold of their own futures, have become the standard-bearers of this authenticity. They possess a clarity that Rachel was only able to forge in the furnace of her own breakdown. They speak their minds, they demand respect, and they walk through the world with an unshakable sense of agency. Rachel watches them and feels a sense of quiet, profound fulfillment. She broke the lineage of silence. She took the poison of her marriage and neutralized it with the antidote of truth, ensuring that her children would never have to guess whether their perceptions of reality were accurate. She has raised them to trust their instincts, to interrogate the intentions of others, and to understand that the greatest power they will ever possess is the ability to walk away from any situation that asks them to shrink themselves. Rachel's work as a consultant has also matured into a form of art. She no longer merely provides advice. She holds space for the transformation of others. She sees the women who come to her, women caught in the same suffocating webs of gaslighting and authority-based abuse, and she sees the young Rachel reflected in their eyes. She recognizes the specific terrified paralysis, the way they hold their bodies in a constant state of bracing for an impact that has not yet happened. She teaches them that the fear they feel is not a weakness, but an alarm system that has been muffled by years of conditioning. She guides them through the cold-blooded logistics of survival, the necessary surgical detachment required to leave a life that is actively killing them. She has become the authority she once sought, turning her tragedy into a beacon for those lost in the dark. She reflects often on the nature of courage, realizing that it was not the absence of fear that drove her, but the decision to act despite it. The moments she spent trembling in the laundry room, the nights she whispered into her pillow to keep from screaming, those were not moments of weakness. They were the labor pains of her independence. She had to undergo an ego death, a shedding of the identity that had been curated for her by a man who thrived on her diminished sense of self. She had to dismantle the internal architecture of the devoted wife and replace it with the steel frame of the autonomous woman. This autonomy has brought a new rhythm to her life. She works now with a sense of purpose that transcends the mundane. Her professional choices, her social circle, and her personal habits are all curated for health and authenticity. She has found that the best way to honor the women Sergio harmed is to live a life that stands in direct opposition to the one he tried to force upon them. By flourishing, by maintaining her sanity, and by raising children who know their own worth, she is casting a light that exposes the shadows of his crimes as small, cowardly, and ultimately ephemeral. The environment she has cultivated is one of absolute intellectual and emotional honesty. She no longer avoids the difficult conversations. If a friend, a neighbor, or a colleague suggests that she should be happier or less intense, she does not apologize. She acknowledges that her intensity is a byproduct of her survival, and she does not hide it. She is comfortable being the person in the room who sees the truth, who asks the hard questions, and who refuses to engage in the polite fictions that keep dysfunctional systems alive. This is not out of malice. It is out of a deep-seated respect for the reality that she was once denied. She has found that being good is not the same as being compliant, and that true goodness often requires the courage to be difficult, to say no, and to stand alone. She has also found a peculiar peace with her own history. There is no longer a before and after that feels disconnected. She understands the continuity of her spirit. The girl who moved from foster home to foster home, the woman who married the officer, and the survivor who stands here today are all the same person. She has simply integrated the experiences, learned the lessons, and discarded the baggage. She is a cohesive individual. She has stopped trying to edit the past and has started to embrace the wisdom it provided, however brutal the tuition may have been. One of her most profound realizations is that she is no longer afraid of being alone. For most of her life, she viewed solitude as a synonym for loneliness, a state of being that needed to be filled by the presence of a man. Now she realizes that solitude is a state of being where she is finally in the company of the one person she never really knew, herself. She has become her own best friend, her own confidant, and her own greatest support system. The conversations she has with herself are now characterized by kindness and understanding, rather than the criticism and doubt that Sergio had weaponized against her. She often finds herself looking at her children, struck by the miraculous, fragile beauty of their unburdened lives. They know a version of their mother that is stronger, more present, and more honest than the one who lived in the house in West Sacramento. They see her as she is, a woman who has faults, who has fears, but who is fundamentally, irrevocably committed to their well-being and her own. She is the lighthouse that they can always return to, not because she is perfect but because she is real. As she gazes out at the world from the quiet comfort of her current life, Rachel understands that her salvation was not a gift bestowed upon her. It was a structure she built, beam by beam, in the dead of the night. It was an act of creation, a defiant assertion of her own humanity against the dehumanizing forces of a predator. She has created a sanctuary that is not built on the shifting sands of someone else's promises, but on the granite of her own character. She is the architect, the builder, and the resident of her own destiny, and she knows that she will never, ever be moved again. The fire that once threatened to incinerate her has become the light that guides her path. The lessons she learned have become the values she lives by. The person she was has become the person she is, a testament to the fact that the human soul is not easily extinguished, that the truth will always have the final say, and that a life reclaimed from the jaws of a predator is a life that is, in every way, infinitely more precious than it ever was before. She is finally, fully, and irrevocably her own woman, and that, she knows, is the ultimate triumph. Every breath she takes, every laugh she shares, every achievement she celebrates is a defiance of the past, and a dedication to the beautiful, expansive future she has carved out for herself. She was always strong enough to walk away. And today she is finally free to walk toward a life that is hers, entirely and forever. This is not the end of a story. It is the permanent, resonant, and beautiful beginning of her own truth. As the summer sun of July 2026 hangs high over the lush landscape of her Florida sanctuary, Rachel Alvarez finds herself in a moment of profound, crystalline stillness. The journey that brought her here, from the stifling, claustrophobic domesticity of West Sacramento to this expansive, light-filled reality, has been the defining odyssey of her life. She sits on her veranda, a coffee in hand, watching the shadows dance across the grass, and recognizes that she is no longer merely a survivor. She has evolved into a sovereign being, a woman whose life is no longer defined by the trauma she endured, but by the extraordinary reclamation she orchestrated. The man who once sought to own her, to define her reality, and to weaponize her loyalty has been reduced to a historical footnote in the long, vibrant narrative of her own self-determination. The architecture of her piece is built upon a foundation of radical, uncompromising honesty. For 18 years, Rachel had lived in a house of mirrors, where every reflection was distorted by the needs and the dark appetites of a predator. She had been trained to look at him and see a protector, to look at herself and see a failure, and to look at their life and see a success. The collapse of that house was the most terrifying event of her existence, but it was also the most liberating. Standing amidst the ruins, she had to learn how to see the world without the filter of his gaslighting. She had to learn that the cold air on her skin, the sharp edge of a truth, and the weight of her own autonomy were not threats, but the essential elements of a real life. Today, Rachel's home is a sanctuary of clarity. There are no secrets tucked away in the closets. There are no hidden agendas guiding her interactions. She has replaced the performative intimacy of her past with a genuine, grounded connection to the people who populate her world. Her children are the primary beneficiaries of this transformation. They have blossomed into individuals who understand that their worth is not contingent upon their compliance or their ability to uphold a family image. They carry with them the lesson of their mother's courage, that the truth, no matter how jagged or painful, is always preferable to the most comfortable lie. They are the living evidence of a cycle broken, a testament to the fact that Rachel's fight was never just for herself. It was for the integrity of their future. In her work as a consultant and advocate, Rachel has found a vocation that gives resonance to her past. She meets with women who are currently where she was a decade and a half ago, paralyzed by the fear that their intuition is wrong, that their perception of their partner's abuse is a misunderstanding, and that they are responsible for the darkness encroaching on their lives. Rachel doesn't give them false comfort. She provides them with the tools of critical observation, helping them to map the patterns of their partner's behavior against the cold, hard reality of their own experiences. She teaches them the language of survival, how to secure documentation, how to build a contingency plan, and most importantly, how to reclaim the authority of their own minds. She has become the authority she once sought, serving as a beacon for those who are struggling to find their way through the fog. There is a deep, resonant maturity in the way Rachel navigates her life now. She no longer seeks the approval of the community that was once so quick to judge her, or the validation of a partner to justify her existence. She has discovered that the internal satisfaction of a life lived with integrity is the only validation that holds any weight. She has moved beyond the need to fix her past or to justify the choices she made while under the influence of his control. She understands that she was a product of her own desperation and his meticulous manipulation, and she has extended a hand of forgiveness to that younger version of herself. She holds that past version of Rachel with tenderness, acknowledging that she did the best she could with the information and the power she had at the time. The solitude she once feared has become her greatest luxury. It is in the quiet hours of the morning or the calm expanse of the evening that she reconnects with the core of her own humanity. She has learned that solitude is not a state of being to be avoided. It is a space for the soul to stretch and breathe. In these moments, she is the sole architect of her thoughts, the only voice that dictates the cadence of her life. She finds beauty in the mundanity, the process of tending to her garden, the ritual of her daily exercises, the depth of the books she reads, and the joy of a life that is entirely vibrantly her own. Every day she lives is a conscious choice, a deliberate act of freedom that honors the struggle that brought her here. She has also found a profound, lasting peace with the nature of her own humanity. She no longer strives for the hollow ideal of perfection. She embraces her own capacity for doubt, her moments of lingering fear, and her occasional need for isolation as essential parts of a life lived in truth. She does not hide her vulnerabilities. She integrates them into a character that is strong, resilient, and deeply empathetic. She is a woman who has walked through the fire and learned that the fire didn't destroy her. It tempered her. It burned away the illusions, the dependencies, and the performative expectations, leaving behind the solid, incorruptible essence of who she was always meant to be. As she moves into the later years of her life, Rachel feels a sense of quiet triumph. She is a woman who has finally arrived, not at a destination, not at a status, and not at a relationship, but at herself. The nightmare of the badge, the coldness of the investigation, and the long, slow climb out of the abyss are all part of a story that is now fully hers to tell. She has reclaimed the power of her own narrative. She is the author, the protagonist, and the final word. She knows that she is worthy of the truth, that she is strong enough to weather the storm, and that she is fundamentally the master of her own salvation. The legacy of her life is not measured by the scale of her fame or the size of her fortune. It is measured by the quality of her freedom. She has carved out a life that is elegant, sturdy, and profoundly beautiful. She has proven that it is possible to lose everything you thought you were, and find everything you were always meant to be. As she stands in the center of her life, watching the sun set over the horizon of her reclaimed reality, she feels a sense of quiet, unshakable triumph. She is the architect, the builder, and the resident of her own destiny. Every choice she makes is a testament to the fact that she has not only survived, but she has thrived. She is Rachel Alvarez and she is free. Her story is a map for any woman who has ever felt trapped, a signal in the dark that says, "I made it out, and you can too." The monster is a ghost of the past, but she is the master of her present, and she is building a legacy that will outlive the pain. A legacy of truth, of courage, and of the enduring power of a woman who chose to live. Every breath she takes is an assertion of that freedom. Every day she lives is a celebration of that truth. And every choice she makes is a testament to the fact that she has not only survived, but she has thrived. This is her victory, and it is a victory that is silent, steady, and entirely beautifully her own.